Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 71. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, Chapter 71. All next day, Emma Haredale, Dolly, and Miggs remained cooped up together in what had now been their prison for so many days, without seeing any person or hearing any sound but the murmured conversation in an outer room of the men who kept watch over them. There appeared to be more of these fellows than there had been hitherto, and they could no longer hear the voices of women, which they had before plainly distinguished. Some new excitement, too, seemed to prevail among them, for there was much stealthy going in and out, and a constant questioning of those who were newly arrived. They had previously been quite reckless in their behaviour, often making a great uproar, quarrelling among themselves, fighting, dancing, and singing. They were now very subdued and silent, conversing almost in whispers, and stealing in and out with a soft and stealthy tread, very different from the boisterous trampling in which their arrivals and departures had hitherto been announced to the trembling captives. Whether this change was occasioned by the presence among them of some person of authority in their ranks, or by any other cause, they were unable to decide. Sometimes they thought it was in part attributable to there being a sick man in the chamber, for last night there had been a shuffling of feet, as though a burden were brought in, and afterwards a moaning noise; but they had no means of ascertaining the truth, for any questions or entreaty on their parts only provoked a storm of execrations, or something worse, and they were too happy to be left alone, unassailed by threats or admiration, to risk even that comfort by any voluntary communication with those who held them in durance. It was sufficiently evident both to Emma and to the locksmith's poor little daughter herself that she, Dolly, was the great object of attraction, and that so soon as they should have leisure to indulge in the softer passion, Hugh and Mr Tappertit would certainly fall to blows for her sake, in which latter case it was not very difficult to see whose prize she would become. With all her old horror of that man revived, and deepened into a degree of aversion and abhorrence which no language can describe, with a thousand old recollections and regrets and causes of distress, anxiety, and fear besetting her on all sides, poor Dolly Varden, sweet, blooming, buxom Dolly, began to hang her head and fade and droop like a beautiful flower. The colour fled from her cheeks, her courage forsook her, her gentle heart failed. Unmindful of all her provoking caprices, forgetful of all her conquests and inconstancy, with all her winning little vanities quite gone, she nestled all the livelong day in Emma Haredale's bosom, and sometimes calling on her dear old grey-haired father, sometimes on her mother, and sometimes even on her old home, pined slowly away, like a poor bird in its cage. Light hearts that float so gaily on a smooth stream, that are so sparkling and buoyant in the sunshine, down upon fruit, bloom upon flowers, blush in summer air, life of the winged insect, whose whole existence is a day, how soon ye sink in troubled water! Poor Dolly's heart! A little, gentle, idle, fickle thing, giddy, restless, fluttering, constant to nothing but bright looks, and smiles, and laughter. Dolly's heart was breaking. Emma had known grief, and could bear it better. She had little comfort to impart, but she could soothe and tend her, and she did so. And Dolly clung to her like a child to its nurse. In endeavouring to inspire her with some fortitude, she increased her own, and though the nights were long and the days dismal, and she felt the wasting influence of watching and fatigue, and had perhaps a more defined and clear perception of their destitute condition and its worst dangers, she uttered no complaint. Before the ruffians in whose power they were, she bore herself so calmly, and with such an appearance, in the midst of all her terror, of a secret conviction that they dared not harm her, that there was not a man among them but held her in some degree of dread, and more than one believed she had a weapon hidden in her dress and was prepared to use it. Such was their condition when they were joined by Miss Miggs, who gave them to understand that she too had been taken prisoner because of her charms, and detailed such feats of resistance she had performed, her virtue having given her supernatural strength, that they all felt it quite a happiness to have her for a champion. Nor was this the only comfort they derived at first from Miggs's presence and society, for that young lady displays such resignation and long suffering, and so much meek endurance under her trials, and breathed in all her chaste discourse a spirit of such holy confidence and resignation, and devout belief that all would happen for the best, that Emma felt her courage strengthened by the bright example, never doubting but that everything she said was true, and that she, like them, was torn from all she loved, and agonized by doubt and apprehension. As to poor Dolly, she was roused at first by seeing one who came from home, but when she heard under what circumstances she had left it, and into whose hands her father had fallen, she wept more bitterly than ever, and refused all comfort. Miss Miggs was at some trouble to reprove her for this state of mind, and to entreat her to take example by herself, who, she said, was now receiving back with interest tenfold the amount of her subscriptions to the red brick dwelling house, in the articles of peace and mind and a quiet conscience. And while on serious topics, Miss Miggs considered it her duty to try her hand at the conversion of Miss Haredale, for whose improvement she launched into a polemical address of some length, in the course whereof she likened herself unto a chosen missionary, and that young lady to a cannibal in darkness. Indeed, she returned so often to these subjects, and so frequently called upon them to take a lesson from her, at the same time vaunting, and, as it were, rioting in, her huge unworthiness and abundant excess of sin, that in the course of a short time she became, in that small chamber, rather a nuisance than a comfort, and rendered them, if possible, even more unhappy than they had been before. The night had now come, and for the first time, for their jailers had been regular in bringing food and candles, they were left in darkness. Any change in their condition in such a place inspired new fears, and when some hours had passed, and the gloom was still unbroken, Emma could no longer repress her alarm. They listened attentively. There was the same murmuring in the outer room, and now and then a moan which seemed to be wrung from a person in great pain, who made an effort to subdue it, but could not. Even these men seemed to be in darkness too, for no light shone through the chinks in the door, nor were they moving, as their custom was, but quite still, the silence being unbroken by so much as the creaking of a board. At first Miss Miggs wondered greatly in her own mind who this sick person might be, but arriving on second thoughts at the conclusion that he was a part of the schemes on foot, and an artful device soon to be employed with great success, she opined, for Miss Haredale's comfort, that it must be some misguided papist who had been wounded, and this happy supposition encouraged her to say under her breath, "Alleluia," several times. "Is it possible," said Emma, with some indignation, "that you who have seen these men committing the outrages you have told us of, and who have fallen into their hands like us, can exult in their cruelties?" "Personal considerations, miss," rejoined Miggs, "sinks into nothing afore a noble cause. Alleluia, 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 good gentlemen." It seemed, from the shrill pertinency with which Miss Miggs repeated this form of acclamation, that she was calling the same through the keyhole of the door, but in the profound darkness she could not be seen. If the time has come, Heaven knows it may come at any moment, when they are bent on prosecuting the designs, whatever they may be, with which they have brought us here, can you still encourage and take part with them?" demanded Emma. "I thank my goodness gracious blessed stars I can, miss," returned Miggs with increased energy. "Alleluia, good gentlemen." Even Dolly, cast down and disappointed as she was, revived at this, and bade Miggs hold her tongue directly. "Which was you pleased to observe, Miss Varden?" said Miggs, with a strong emphasis on the irrelative pronoun. Dolly repeated her request. "Oh, gracious me!" cried Miggs, with hysterical derision. "Oh, gracious me! Yes, to be sure I will. Oh, yes, I am an abject slave, and a toiling, moiling, constant working, always being found fault with, never giving satisfactions, nor having no time to clean one's self, potter's wessel, ain't I, miss? Oh, yes. My situations is lowly, and my capacities is limited, and my duties is to humble myself afore the base degenerating daughters of their blessed mothers as is fit to keep companies with holy saints, but is born to persecutions from wicked relations, and to demean myself before them as is no better than infidels. Ain't it, miss? Oh, yes. My only becoming occupations is to help young flaunting pagans to brush and comb and tittivate theirselves into whitening and sepulchres, and leave the young men to think that there ain't a bit of padding in it, nor no pinching ins, nor fillings out, nor pomatums, nor deceits, nor earthly wanities. Ain't it, miss? Yes, to be sure it is. Oh, yes. Having delivered these ironical passages with a most wonderful volubility, and with a shrillness perfectly deafening, especially when she jerked out the interjections, Miss Miggs, from mere habit, and not because weeping was at all appropriate to the occasion, which was one of triumph, concluded by bursting into a flood of tears, and calling in an impassioned manner on the name of Simmuns. What Emma Haredale and Dolly would have done, or how long Miss Miggs, now that she had hoisted her true colours, would have gone on waving them before their astonished senses, it is impossible to tell. Nor is it necessary to speculate on these matters, for a startling interruption occurred at that moment which took their whole attention by storm. There was a violent knocking at the door of the house, and then its sudden bursting open, which was immediately succeeded by a scuffle in the room without, and the clash of weapons. Transported with the hope that rescue had at length arrived, Emma and Dolly shrieked aloud for help, nor were their shrieks unanswered, for after a hurried interval a man, bearing in one hand a drawn sword, and in the other a taper, rushed into the chamber where they were confined. It was some check upon their transport to find in this person an entire stranger, but they appealed to him nevertheless, and besought him, in impassioned language, to restore them to their friends. For what other purpose am I here? He answered, closing the door and standing with his back against it. With what object have I made my way to this place through difficulty and danger but to preserve you? With a joy for which it was impossible to find adequate expression, they embraced each other, and thanked Heaven for this most timely aid. Their deliverer stepped forward for a moment to put the light upon the table, and immediately returning to his former position against the door, bared his head, and looked on smilingly. 'You have news of my uncle, sir?' said Emma, turning hastily towards him. 'And of my father and mother?' asked Dolly. 'Yes,' he said, 'good news.' 'They are alive and unhurt?' they both cried at once. 'Yes, and unhurt,' he rejoined. 'And close at hand?' 'I did not say close at hand,' he answered smoothly. 'They are at no great distance. Your friends, sweet one,' he added, addressing Dolly, 'are within a few hours' journey. You will be restored to them, I hope, to night.' 'My uncle, sir,' faltered Emma. 'Your uncle, dear Miss Haredale, happily I say happily because he has succeeded where many of our creed have failed, and is safe has crossed the sea, and is out of Britain.' 'I thank God for it,' said Emma faintly. 'You say well. You have reason to be thankful greater reason than it is possible for you, who have seen but one night of these cruel outrages, to imagine. Does he desire,' said Emma, 'that I should follow him?' 'Do you ask if he desires it?' cried the stranger in surprise. 'If he desires it. But you do not know the danger of remaining in England, the difficulty of escape, or the price hundreds would pay to secure the means when you make that inquiry. Pardon me. I had forgotten that you could not, being prisoner here.' 'I gather, sir,' said Emma, after a moment's pause, 'from what you hint at, but fear to tell me, that I have witnessed but the beginning and the least of the violence to which we are exposed, and that it has not yet slackened in its fury.' He shrugged his shoulders, shook his head, lifted up his hands, and with the same smooth style, which was not a pleasant one to see, cast his eyes upon the ground, and remained silent. 'You may venture, sir, to speak plain,' said Emma, 'and to tell me the worst. We have undergone some preparation for it.' But here Dolly interposed, and entreated her not to hear the worst, but the best, and besought the gentleman to tell them the best, and to keep the remainder of his news until they were safe among their friends again. It is told in 3 words, he said, glancing at the locksmith's daughter with a look of some displeasure. The people have risen to a man against us. The streets are filled with soldiers who support them and do their bidding. We have no protection but from above, and no safety but in flight, and that is a poor resource, for we are watched on every hand, and detained here both by force and fraud. Miss Haredale, I cannot bear, believe me that I cannot bear, by speaking of myself or what I have done, or am prepared to do, to seem to vaunt my services before you. But having powerful Protestant connections, and having my whole wealth embarked with theirs in shipping and commerce, I happily possessed the means of saving your uncle. I have the means of saving you, and in redemption of my sacred promise made to him, I am here, pledged not to leave you until I have placed you in his arms. The treachery or penitence of one of the men about you led to the discovery of your place of confinement, and that I have forced my way here, sword in hand, you see.' 'You bring,' said Emma, faltering, 'some note or token from my uncle?' 'No, he doesn't,' cried Dolly, pointing at him earnestly. 'Now I am sure he doesn't. Don't go with him for the world.' 'Hush, pretty fool, be silent,' he replied, frowning angrily upon her. 'No, Miss Haredale, I have no letter, nor any token of any kind; for while I sympathise with you and such as you, on whom misfortune so heavy and so undeserved has fallen, I value my life. I carry, therefore, no writing which, found upon me, would lead to its certain loss. I never thought of bringing any other token, nor did Mr Haredale think of entrusting me with one, possibly because he had good experience of my faith and honesty, and owed his life to me.' There was a reproof conveyed in these words, which to a nature like Emma Haredale's was well addressed. But Dolly, who was differently constituted, was by no means touched by it, and still conjured her, in all the terms of affection and attachment she could think of, not to be lured away. 'Time presses,' said their visitor, although he sought to express the deepest interest, had something cold and even in his speech that grated on the ear, 'and danger surrounds us. If I have exposed myself to it, in vain, let it be so. But if you and he should ever meet again, do me justice. If you decide to remain, as I think you do, remember, Miss Haredale, that I left you with a solemn caution, and acquitting myself of all the consequences to which you expose yourself. Stay, sir,' cried Emma, 'one moment, I beg you. Cannot we,' and she drew Dolly closer to her, 'cannot we go together? The task of conveying one female in safety through such scenes as we must encounter, to say nothing of attracting the attention of those who crowd the streets,' he answered, 'is enough. I have said that she will be restored to her friends tonight. If you accept the service I tender, Miss Haredale, she shall be instantly placed in safe conduct, and that promise redeemed. Do you decide to remain? People of all ranks and creeds are flying from the town, which is sacked from end to end. Let me be of use in some quarter. Do you stay or go?' 'Dolly,' said Emma, in a hurried manner, 'my dear girl, this is our last hope. If we part now, it is only that we may meet again in happiness and honour. I will trust to this gentleman.' 'No, no, no!' cried Dolly, clinging to her. 'Pray, pray do not.' 'You hear,' said Emma, 'that to night, only to night, within a few hours, think of that, you will be among those who would die of grief to lose you, and who are now plunged in the deepest misery for your sake. Pray for me, dear girl, as I will for you, and never forget the many quiet hours we have passed together. Say one God bless you. Say that at parting.' But Dolly could say nothing. No, not when Emma kissed her cheek 100 times, and covered it with tears, could she do more than hang upon her neck, and sob, and clasp, and hold her tight. 'We have time for no more of this,' cried the man, unclenching her hands and pushing her roughly off, as he drew Emma Haredale towards the door. 'Now, quick, outside there. Are you ready?' 'Ay!' cried a loud voice, which made him start. 'Quite ready. Stand back here, for your lives!' And in an instant he was felled like an ox in the butcher's shambles, struck down as though a block of marble had fallen from the roof and crushed him, and cheerful light beaming faces came pouring in, and Emma was clasped in her uncle's embrace, and Dolly, with a shriek that pierced the ear, fell into the arms of her father and mother. What fainting there was, what laughing, what crying, what sobbing, what smiling, how much questioning, no answering, all talking together, all beside themselves with joy, what kissing, congratulating, embracing, shaking of hands, and falling into all these raptures over and over and over again, no language can describe. At length, and after a long time, the old locksmith went up and fairly hugged two strangers, who had stood apart and left them to themselves, and then they saw whom? Yes, Edward Chester and Joseph Willet. "See here," said the locksmith, "see here. Where would any of us been without these two? Oh, Mr. Edward, Mr. Edward! Oh, Joe, Joe, how light and yet so full you have made my old heart to-night!" "It was Mr. Edward that knocked him down, sir," said Joe. "I longed to do it, but I gave it up to him. Come, you brave and honest gentlemen, get your senses together, for you haven't long to lie here." He had his foot upon the breast of their sham deliverer in the absence of a spare arm, and gave him a gentle roll as he spoke. Gashford, for it was no other, crouching yet malignant, raised his scowling face like sin subdued, and pleaded to be gently used. "I have access to all my lord's papers, Mr. Haredale," he said in a submissive voice. Mr. Haredale, keeping his back towards him, and not once looking round. "There are very important documents among them. There are a great many in secret drawers and distributed in various places, known only to my lord and me. I can give some very valuable information and render important assistance to any inquiry. You will have to answer it if I receive ill usage." "Pah!" said Joe, in deep disgust. "Get up, man. You're waited for, outside. Get up, do you hear?" Gashford slowly rose, and picking up his hat, and looking with a baffled malevolence, yet with an air of despicable humility, all round the room, crawled out. "And now, gentlemen," said Joe, who seemed to be the spokesman of the party, for all the rest were silent, "the sooner we get back to the Black Lion, the better, perhaps." Mr. Haredale nodded assent, and drawing his niece's arm through his, and taking one of her hands between his own, passed out straightway, followed by the locksmith, Mrs Varden, and Dolly, who would scarcely have presented a sufficient surface for all the hugs and caresses they bestowed upon her though she had been a dozen Dollys. Edward Chester and Joe followed. And did Dolly never once look behind? Not once? Was there not one little fleeting glimpse of the dark eyelash, almost resting on her flushed cheek, and of the downcast sparkling eye it shaded? Joe thought there was, and he is not likely to have been mistaken, for there were not many eyes like Dolly's, that's the truth. The outer room through which they had to pass was full of men, among them Mr Dennis in safe keeping, and there had been since yesterday, lying in hiding behind a wooden screen which was now thrown down, Simon Tappertit, the recreant prentice, burnt and bruised, and with a gunshot wound in his body, and his legs, his perfect legs, the pride and glory of his life, the comfort of his existence, crushed into shapeless ugliness. Wondering no longer at the moans they had heard, Dolly kept closer to her father, and shuddered at the sight. But neither bruises, burns, nor gunshot wound, nor all the torture of his shattered limbs, sent half so keen a pang to Simon's breast as Dolly passing out with Joe for her preserver. A coach was ready at the door, and Dolly found herself safe and whole inside, between her father and mother, with Emma Haredale and her uncle, quite real, sitting opposite. But there was no Joe, no Edward, and they had said nothing. They had only bowed once, and kept at a distance. Dear heart, what a long way it was to the Black Lion. End of chapter 71. Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 72. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, Chapter 72. The Black Lion was so far off, and occupied such a length of time in the getting at, that notwithstanding the strong presumptive evidence she had about her of the late events being real and of actual occurrence, Dolly could not divest herself of the belief that she must be in a dream which was lasting all night. nor was she quite certain that she saw and heard with her own proper senses, even when the coach, in the fullness of time, stopped at the Black Lion, and the host of that tavern approached in a gush of cheerful light to help them to dismount, and give them hearty welcome. There too, at the coach door, one on one side, one upon the other, was already Edward Chester and Joe Willet, who must have followed in another coach; and this was such a strange and unaccountable proceeding, that Dolly was the more inclined to favour the idea of her being fast asleep. But when Mr. Willet appeared, old John himself, so heavy handed and obstinate, and with such a double chin as the liveliest imagination could never in its boldest flights have conjured up in all its vast proportions, that she stood corrected, and unwillingly admitted to herself that she was broad awake. And Joe had lost an arm. He, that well made, handsome, gallant fellow! As Dolly glanced towards him and thought of the pain he must have suffered, and the far off places in which he had been wandering, and wondered who had been his nurse, and hoped that whoever it was, she had been as kind and gentle and considerate as she would have been, the tears came rising to her bright eyes, one by one, little by little, until she could keep them back no longer, and so before them all wept bitterly. "We are all safe now, Dolly," said her father kindly. "We shall not be separated any more. Cheer up, my love, cheer up." The locksmith's wife knew better perhaps than he what ailed her daughter, but Mrs Varden, being quite an altered woman, for the riots had done that good, added her word to his, and comforted her with similar representations. "Mayhap," said Mr Willet senior, looking round upon the company, "she's hungry. That's what it is, depend upon it. I am myself." The Black Lion, who, like old John, had been waiting supper past all reasonable and conscionable hours, hailed this as a philosophical discovery of the profoundest and most penetrating kind, and the table being already spread, they sat down to supper straightway. The conversation was not of the liveliest nature, nor were the appetites of some of them very keen, but in both these respects old John more than atoned for any deficiency on the part of the rest, and very much distinguished himself. It was not in point of actual conversation that Mr Willet shone so brilliantly, for he had none of his old cronies to tackle, and was rather timorous of venturing on Joe, having certain vague misgivings within him that he was ready, on the shortest notice, and on receipt of the slightest offence, to fell the Black Lion to the floor of his own parlour, and immediately to withdraw to China or some other remote and unknown region, there to dwell for evermore, or at least until he had got rid of his remaining arm and both legs, and perhaps an eye or so into the bargain. It was with a peculiar kind of pantomime that Mr Willet filled up every pause, and in this he was considered by the Black Lion, who had been his familiar for some years, quite to surpass and go beyond himself, and outrun the expectations of his most admiring friends. The subject that worked in Mr Willet's mind and occasioned these demonstrations was no other than his son's bodily disfigurement, which he had never yet got himself thoroughly to believe or comprehend. Shortly after their first meeting he had been observed to wander in a state of great perplexity to the kitchen, and to direct his gaze towards the fire, as if in search of his usual adviser in all matters of doubt and difficulty. But there being no boiler at the Black Lion, and the rioters having so beaten and battered his own that it was quite unfit for further service, he wandered out again in a perfect bog of uncertainty and mental confusion, and in that state took the strangest means of resolving his doubts, such as feeling the sleeve of his son's greatcoat as deeming it possible that his arm might be there, looking at his own arms and those of everybody else's, as if to assure himself that two and not one was the usual allowance, sitting by the hour together in a brown study, as if he were endeavouring to recall Joe's image in his younger days, and to remember whether he really had in those times one arm or a pair, and employing himself in many other speculations of the same kind. Finding himself at this supper, surrounded by faces with which he had been so well acquainted in old times, Mr Willet recurred to the subject with uncommon vigour, apparently resolved to understand it now or never. Sometimes, after every 2 or 3 mouthfuls, he laid down his knife and fork, and stared at his son with all his might, particularly at his maimed side. Then he looked slowly round the table until he caught some person's eye, when he shook his head with great solemnity, patted his shoulder, winked, or as one may say, for winking was a very slow process with him, went to sleep with one eye for a minute or two, and so, with another solemn shaking of his head, took up his knife and fork again and went on eating. Sometimes he put his food into his mouth abstractedly, and with all his faculties concentrated on Joe, gazed at him in a fit of stupefaction as he cut his meat with one hand, until he was recalled to himself by symptoms of choking on his own part, or was by that means restored to consciousness. At other times he resorted to such small devices as asking him for the salt, the pepper, the vinegar, the mustard, anything that was on his maimed side, and watching him as he handed it. By dint of these experiments, he did at last so satisfy and convince himself that after a longer silence than he had yet maintained, he laid down his knife and fork on either side his plate, drank a long draught from a tankard beside him, still keeping his eyes on Joe, and leaning backward in his chair and fetching a long breath, and said as he looked all round the board, "It's been took off." "By George!" said the Black Lion, striking the table with his hand, "he's got it." "Yes, sir," said Mr Willet, with the look of a man who felt that he had earned a compliment and deserved it. "That's where it is. It's been took off." "Tell him where it was done," said the Black Lion to Joe. "At the defence of the Savannah, father." "At the defence of the Salwanners," repeated Mr Willet softly, again looking round the table. "In America, where the war is," said Joe. "In America, where the war is," repeated Mr Willet. "It was took off in the defence of the Salwanners in America, where the war is." Continuing to repeat these words to himself in a low tone of voice (the same information had been conveyed to him in the same terms at least 50 times before), Mr Willet arose from table, walked round to Joe, felt his empty sleeve all the way up, from the cuff to where the stump of his arm remained, shook his hand, lighted his pipe at the fire, took a long whiff, walked to the door, turned round once when he had reached it, wiped his left eye with the back of his forefinger, and said in a faltering voice, "My son's arm was took off at the defence of the Salwanners in America, where the war is," with which words he withdrew, and returned no more that night. Indeed, on various pretences, they all withdrew one after another, save Dolly, who was left sitting there alone. It was a great relief to be alone, and she was crying to her heart's content, when she heard Joe's voice at the end of the passage, bidding somebody good night. Good night. That he was going elsewhere. To some distance, perhaps. To what kind of home could he be going, now that it was so late? She heard him walk along the passage and past the door, but there was a hesitation in his footsteps. He turned back. Dolly's heart beat high. He looked in. "Good night." He didn't say Dolly, but there was comfort in his not saying Miss Varden. "Good night," sobbed Dolly. "I am sorry to take you on so much, for what is past and gone," said Joe kindly. "Don't. I can't bear to see you do it. Think of it no longer. You are safe and happy now." Dolly cried the more. "You must have suffered very much within these few days, and yet you're not changed, unless it's for the better. They said you were, but I don't see it. You were always very beautiful," said Joe, "but you are more beautiful than ever now. You are indeed. There can be no harm in my saying so, for you must know it. You are told so very often, I am sure." As a general principle, Dolly did know it, and was told so, very often. But the coachmaker had turned out years ago to be a special donkey, and whether she had been afraid of making similar discoveries in others, or had grown by dint of long custom to be careless of compliments generally, certain it is that although she cried so much, she was better pleased to be told so now, than ever she had been in all her life. I shall bless your name,' sobbed the locksmith's little daughter, 'as long as I live. I shall never hear it spoken without feeling as if my heart would burst. I shall remember it in my prayers every night and morning till I die.' 'Will you?' said Joe eagerly. 'Will you indeed? It makes me well, it makes me very glad and proud to hear you say so.' Dolly still sobbed, and held her handkerchief to her eyes. Joe still stood looking at her. 'Your voice,' said Joe, 'brings up old times so pleasantly, that for the moment I feel as if that night there can be no harm in talking of that night now had come back, and nothing had happened in the meantime. I feel as if I hadn't suffered any hardships, but had knocked down poor Tom Cobb only yesterday, and had come to see you with my bundle on my shoulder before running away. You remember?' Remember! But she said nothing. She raised her eyes for an instant. It was but a glance, a little tearful, timid glance. It kept Joe silent, though, for a long time. 'Well,' he said stoutly, 'it was to be otherwise, and was. I have been abroad, fighting all the summer, and frozen up all the winter, ever since. I have come back in poor in purse as I went, and crippled for life besides. But, Dolly, I would rather have lost this other arm, I would rather have lost my head, than have come back to find you dead, or anything but what I always pictured you to myself, and what I always hoped and wished to find you. Thank God for all!' Oh, how much, and how keenly, the little coquette of 5 years ago felt now! She had found her heart at last. Never having known its worth till now, she had never known the worth of his. How priceless it appeared! 'I did hope once,' said Joe, in his homely way, 'that I might come back a rich man, and marry you. But I was a boy then, and have long known better than that. I am a poor, maimed, discharged soldier, and must be content to rub through life as I can. I can't say even now that I shall be glad to see you married, Dolly, but I am glad. Yes, I am, and glad to think I can say so, to know that you are admired and courted, and can pick and choose for a happy life. It's a comfort to me to know that you'll talk to your husband about me, and I hope the time will come when I may be able to like him, and to shake hands with him, and to come and see you as a poor friend who knew you when you were a girl. God bless you.' His hand did tremble, but for all that, he took it away again, and left her. End of chapter 72. Barnaby Rudge, chapter 73. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, chapter 73. By this Friday night, for it was on Friday in the riot week that Emma and Dolly were rescued by the timely aid of Joe and Edward Chester, the disturbances were entirely quelled, and peace and order were restored to the affrighted city. True, after what had happened, it was impossible for any man to say how long this better state of things might last, or how suddenly new outrages, exceeding even those so lately witnessed, might burst forth and fill its streets with ruin and bloodshed. For this reason, those who had fled from the recent tumults still kept at a distance, and many families hitherto unable to procure the means of flight, now availed themselves of the calm, and withdrew into the country. The shops too, from Tyburn to Whitechapel, were still shut, and very little business was transacted in any of the places of great commercial resort. But notwithstanding, and in spite of the melancholy forebodings of that numerous class of society who see with the great clearness into the darkest perspectives, the town remained profoundly quiet. The strong military force disposed in every advantageous quarter, and stationed at every commanding point, held the scattered fragments of the mob in check. The search after rioters was prosecuted with unrelenting vigour, and if there were any among them so desperate and reckless as to be inclined, after the terrible scenes they had beheld, to venture forth again, they were so daunted by these resolute measures that they quickly shrunk into their hiding places and had no thought but for their safety. In a word, the crowd was utterly routed. Upwards of 200 had been shot dead in the streets. 250 more were lying badly wounded in the hospitals, of whom 70 or 80 died within a short time afterwards. 100 were already in custody, and more were taken every hour. How many perished in the conflagrations, or by their own excesses, is unknown, but that numbers found a terrible grave in the hot ashes of the flames they had kindled, or crept into vaults and cellars to drink in secret or to nurse their sores, and never saw the light again, is certain. When the embers of the fires had been black and cold for many weeks, the labourers' spades proved this beyond a doubt. 72 private houses and 4 strong jails were destroyed in the 4 great days of these riots. The total loss of property, as estimated by the sufferers, was £155,000. At the lowest and least partial estimate of disinterested persons, it exceeded £125,000. For this immense loss, compensation was soon afterwards made out of the public purse, in pursuance of a vote in the House of Commons, the sum being levied on the various wards in the city, on the country, and the borough of Southwark. Both Lord Mansfield and Lord Savile, however, who had been great sufferers, refused to accept of any compensation whatever. The House of Commons, sitting on Tuesday with locked and guarded doors, had passed a resolution to the effect that as soon as the tumult subsided, it would immediately proceed to consider the petitions presented from many of his Majesty's Protestant subjects, and would take the same into its serious consideration. While this question was under debate, Mr. Herbert, one of the members present, indignantly rose and called upon the House to observe that Lord George Gordon was then sitting under the gallery with the blue cockade, the signal of rebellion, in his hat. He was not only obliged by those who sat near to take it out, but offering to go into the street to pacify the mob, with a somewhat indefinite assurance that the House was prepared to give them the satisfaction they sought, was actually held down in his seat by the combined force of several members. In short, the disorder and violence which reigned triumphant out of doors penetrated into the Senate, and there, as elsewhere, terror and alarm prevailed, and ordinary forms were for the time forgotten. On the Thursday, both Houses had adjourned until the following Monday se'nnight, declaring it impossible to pursue their deliberations with the necessary gravity and freedom, while they were surrounded by armed troops. And now that the rioters were dispersed, the citizens were beset with a new fear, for finding the public thoroughfares and all their useful places of resort filled with soldiers entrusted with the free use of fire and sword, they began to lend a greedy ear to the rumours which were afloat of martial law being declared, and to dismal stories of prisoners having been seen hanging on lamp-posts in Cheapside and Fleet Street. These terrors being promptly dispelled by a proclamation declaring that all the rioters in custody would be tried by a special commission in due course of law, a fresh alarm was engendered by its being whispered abroad that French money had been found on some of the rioters, and that the disturbances had been fomented by foreign powers who sought to compass the overthrow and ruin of England. This report, which was strengthened by the diffusion of anonymous handbills, but which, if it had any foundation at all, probably owed its origin to the circumstance of some few coins which were not English money having been swept into the pockets of the insurgents with other miscellaneous booty, and afterwards discovered on the prisoners or the dead bodies, caused a great sensation, and men's minds being in that excited state when they are most apt to catch at any shadow of apprehension, was bruited about with much industry. All remaining quiet, however, during the whole of this Friday, and on this Friday night, and no new discoveries being made, confidence began to be restored, and the most timid and desponding breathed again. In Southwark no fewer than 3,000 of the inhabitants formed themselves into a watch and patrolled the streets every hour. nor were the citizens slow to follow so good an example, and it being the manner of peaceful men to be very bold when the danger is over, they were abundantly fierce and daring, not scrupling to question the stoutest passenger with great severity, and carrying it with a very high hand over all errand boys, servant girls, and prentices. As day deepened into evening, and darkness crept into the nooks and corners of the town as if it were mustering in secret and gathering strength to venture into the open ways, Barnaby sat in his dungeon, wondering at the silence, and listening in vain for the noise and outcry which had ushered in the night of late. Beside him, with his hand in hers, sat one in whose companionship he felt at peace. She was worn and altered, full of grief, and heavy hearted, but the same to him. "Mother," he said, after a long silence, "how long, how many days and nights, shall I be kept here?" "Not many, dear, I hope. Not many." "You hope? Ay, but your hoping will not undo these chains. I hope, but they don't mind that. Grip hopes, but who cares for Grip?" The raven gave a short, dull, melancholy croak. It said "Nobody," as plainly as a croak could speak. "Who cares for Grip, except you and me?" said Barnaby, smoothing the bird's rumpled feathers with his hand. "He never speaks in this place. He never says a word in jail. He sits and mopes all day in his dark corner, dozing sometimes, and sometimes looking at the light that creeps in through the bars and shines in his bright eye as if a spark from those great fires had fallen into the room and was burning yet. But who cares for Grip?" The raven croaked again. "Nobody." "And by the way," said Barnaby, withdrawing his hand from the bird, and laying it upon his mother's arms, as he looked eagerly in her face, "if they kill me, they may. I heard it said they would. What will become of Grip when I am dead?" The sound of the word, or the current of his own thoughts, suggested to Grip his old phrase, "Never say die," but he stopped short in the middle of it, drew a dismal cork, and subsided into a faint croak, as if he lacked the heart to get through the shortest sentence. "Will they take his life as well as mine?" said Barnaby. "I wish they would. If you and I and he could die together, there would be none to feel sorry or to grieve for us. But do they what they will, I don't fear them, mother." "They will not harm you," she said, her tears choking her utterance. "They will never harm you, when they know all. I am sure they never will." "Oh, don't be too sure of that!" cried Barnaby, with a strange pleasure in the belief that she was self-deceived, and in his own sagacity. "They have marked me from the first. I heard them say so to each other when they brought me to this place last night, and I believed them. Don't you cry for me. They said that I was bold, and so I am, and so I will be. You may think that I am silly, but I can die as well as another. I have done no harm, have I?" he added quickly. "None before Heaven," she answered. "Why then," said Barnaby, "let them do their worst. You told me once, when I asked you what death meant, that it was nothing to be feared if we did no harm. Ah, mother, you thought I had forgotten that." His merry laugh and playful manner smote her to the heart. She drew him closer to her, and besought him to talk to her in whispers, and to be very quiet, for it was getting dark, and their time was short, and she would soon have to leave him for the night. "You will come to-morrow?" said Barnaby. Yes, and every day, and they would never part again. He joyfully replied that this was well, and what he wished, and what he had felt quite certain she would tell him, and then he asked her where she had been so long, and why she had not come to see him when he had been a great soldier, and ran through the wild schemes he had had for their being rich and living prosperously, and with some faint notion in his mind that she was sad, and he had made her so, tried to console and to comfort her, and talked of their former life, and his old sports and freedom, little dreaming that every word he uttered only increased her sorrow, and that her tears fell faster at the freshened recollection of their lost tranquillity. "Mother," said Barnaby, as they heard the man approaching to close the cells for the night, "when I spoke to you just now about my father, you cried 'Hush!' and turned away your head. Why did you do so? Tell me in a word. You thought he was dead. You are not sorry that he is alive and has come back to us. Where is he? Here? Do not ask any one where he is, or speak about him," she made answer. "Why not?" said Barnaby. "Because he is a stern man and talks roughly? Well, I don't like him or want to be with him by myself, but why not speak about him?" "Because I am sorry that he is alive, sorry that he has come back, and sorry that he and you have ever met, because, dear Barnaby, the endeavour of my life has been to keep you two asunder." "Father and son asunder? Why?" "He has," she whispered in his ear, "he has shed blood. The time has come when you must know it. He has shed the blood of one who loved him well and trusted him, and never did him wrong in word or deed." Barnaby recoiled in horror, and glancing at his stained wrist for an instant, wrapped it, shuddering, in his dress. "But," she added hastily, as the key turned in the lock, "although we shun him, he is your father, dearest, and I am his wretched wife. They seek his life, and he will lose it. It must not be by our means. Nay, if we could win him back to penitence, we should be bound to love him yet. Do not seem to know him except as one who fled with you from the jail, and if they question you about him, do not answer them. God be with you through the night, dear boy, God be with you." She tore herself away, and in a few seconds Barnaby was alone. He stood for a long time rooted to the spot, with his face hidden in his hands, then flung himself sobbing on his miserable bed. But the moon came up slowly in all her gentle glory, and the stars looked out, and through the small compass of the grated window, as through the narrow crevice of one good deed in a murky life of guilt, the face of heaven shone bright and merciful. He raised his head, gazed upward at the quiet sky, which seemed to smile upon the earth in sadness, as if the night, more thoughtful than the day, looked down in sorrow on the sufferings and evil deeds of men, and felt its peace sink deep into his heart. He, a poor idiot, caged in his narrow cell, was as much lifted up to God, while gazing on the mild light, as the freest and most favoured men in all the spacious city, and in his ill-remembered prayer, and in the fragment of the childish hymn with which he sung and crooned himself asleep, there breathed as true a spirit as ever studied homily expressed, or old cathedral arches echoed. As his mother crossed the yard on her way out, she saw, through a grated door which separated it from another court, her husband, walking round and round, with his hands folded on his breast, and his head hung down. She asked the man who conducted her if she might speak a word with this prisoner. Yes, but she must be quick, for he was locking up for the night, and there was but a minute or so to spare. Saying this, he unlocked the door, and bade her go in. It grated harshly as it turned upon its hinges, but he was deaf to the noise, and still walked round and round the little court without raising his head or changing his attitude in the least. She spoke to him, but her voice was weak and failed her. At length she put herself in his track, and when he came near, stretched out her hand and touched him. He started backwards, trembling from head to foot, but seeing who it was, demanded why she came there. Before she could reply, he spoke again. "Am I to live or die? Do you murder too, or spare?" "My son, our son," she answered, "is in this prison." "What is that to me?" he cried, stamping impatiently on the stone pavement. "I know it. He can no more aid me than I can aid him. If you are come to talk of him, begone." As he spoke, he resumed his walk, and hurried round the court as before. When he came again to where she stood, he stopped, and said, "Am I to live or die? Do you repent?" "Oh, do you?" she answered. "Will you, while time remains? Do not believe that I could save you if I dared." "Say if you would," he answered with an oath, as he tried to disengage himself and pass on. "Say if you would." "Listen to me for one moment," she returned, "but for a moment. I am but newly risen from a sick bed, from which I never hope to rise again. The best among us think at such a time of good intentions half performed and duties left undone. If I have ever, since that fatal night, omitted to pray for your repentance before death, if I omitted even then anything which might tend to urge it on you when the horror of your crime was fresh, if, in our later meeting, I yielded to the dread that was upon me, and forgot to fall upon my knees and solemnly adjure you, in the name of him you sent to his account with heaven, to prepare for the retribution which must come, which is stealing on you now, I humbly before you, and in the agony of supplication in which you see me, beseech that you will let me make atonement.' 'What is the meaning of your canting words?' he answered roughly. 'Speak so that I may understand you.' 'I will,' she answered. 'I desire to. Bear with me for a moment more. The hand of him who set his curse on murder is heavy on us now. You cannot doubt it. Our son, our innocent boy, on whom his anger fell before his birth, is in this place in peril of his life, brought here by your guilt, yes, by that alone, as Heaven sees and knows, for he has been led astray in the darkness of his intellect, and that is the terrible consequence of your crime. If you come, woman-like, to load me with reproaches,' he muttered, again endeavouring to break away, 'I do not. I have a different purpose. You must hear it. If not to-night, to-morrow, and if not to-morrow, at another time. You must hear it. Husband, escape is hopeless, impossible.' 'You tell me so, do you?' he said, raising his manacled hand and shaking it. 'You?' 'Yes,' she said, with indescribable earnestness. 'But why?' 'To make me easy in this jail. To make the time twixt this and death pass pleasantly. For my good, yes, for my good, of course,' he said, grinding his teeth, and smiling at her with a livid face. 'Not to load you with reproaches,' she replied, 'not to aggravate the tortures and miseries of your condition, not to give you one hard word, but to restore you to peace and hope. Husband, dear husband, if you will but confess this dreadful crime, if you will but implore forgiveness of heaven and of those you have wronged on earth, if you will dismiss these vain, uneasy thoughts which never can be realized, and will rely on penitence and on the truth, I promise you in the great name of the Creator whose image you have defaced, that He will comfort and console you. And for myself,' she cried, clasping her hands and looking upward, 'I swear before him, as he knows my heart and reads it now, that from that hour I will love and cherish you as I did of old, and watch you night and day in the short interval that will remain to us, and soothe you with my truest love and duty, and pray with you that one threatening judgment may be arrested, and that our boy may be spared to bless God in his poor way in the free air and light.' He fell back and gazed at her while she poured out these words, as though he were for a moment awed by her manner, and knew not what to do. But anger and fear soon got the mastery of him, and he spurned her from him. 'Begone!' he said. 'Leave me! You plot, do you? You plot to get speech with me, and let them know I am the man they say I am. A curse on you and on your boy!' 'On him the curse has already fallen,' she replied, wringing her hands. 'Let it fall heavier, let it fall on one and all. I hate you both. The worst has come to me. The only comfort that I seek or I can have will be the knowledge that it comes to you. Now go!' She would have urged him gently even then, but he menaced her with his chain. 'I say go! I say it for the last time. The gallows has me in its grasp, and it is a black phantom that may urge me on to something more. Begone! I curse the hour that I was born, the man I slew, and all the living world!' In a paroxysm of wrath and terror, and the fear of death, he broke from her, and rushed into the darkness of his cell, where he cast himself jangling down on the stone floor, and smote it with his iron hands. The man returned to lock the dungeon door, and having done so, carried her away. On that warm, balmy night in June, there were glad faces and light hearts in all quarters of the town, and sleep, banished by the late horrors, was deeply welcomed. On that night, families made merry in their houses, and greeted each other on the common danger they had escaped, and those who had been denounced ventured into the streets, and they who had been plundered got good shelter. Even the timorous Lord Mayor, who was summoned that night before the Privy Council to answer for his conduct, came back contented, observing to all his friends that he had got off very well with a reprimand, and repeating with huge satisfaction his memorable defence before the council, that such was his temerity he thought death would have been his portion. On that night, too, more of the scattered remains of the mob were traced to their lurking places and taken, and in the hospitals and deep among the ruins they had made, and in the ditches and fields, many unshrouded wretches lay dead, envied by those who had been active in the disturbances, and who pillowed their doomed heads in the temporary jails. And in the Tower, in a dreary room, whose thick stone walls shut out the hum of life, and made a stillness which the records left by former prisoners with those silent witnesses seemed to deepen and intensify, remorseful for every act that had been done by every man among the cruel crowd, feeling for the time their guilt his own, and their lives put in peril by himself, and finding amid such reflections little comfort in fanaticism, or in his fancied call, sat the unhappy author of all, Lord George Gordon. He had been made prisoner that evening. "If you're sure it's me you want," he said to the officers who waited outside with the warrant for his arrest on a charge of high treason, "I am ready to accompany you," which he did without resistance. He was conducted first before the Privy Council, and afterwards to the Horse Guards, and then was taken by way of Westminster Bridge and back over London Bridge, for the purpose of avoiding the main streets, to the Tower, under the strongest guard ever known to enter its gates with a single prisoner. Of all his 40,000 men, not one remained to bear him company. Friends, dependents, followers, none were there. His fawning secretary had played the traitor, and he whose weakness had been goaded and urged on by so many for their own purposes was desolate and alone. End of chapter 73. Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 74. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge, by Charles Dickens, Chapter 74. Mr. Dennis, having been made prisoner late in the evening, was removed to a neighbouring round-house for that night, and carried before a justice for examination on the next day, Saturday. The charges against him being numerous and weighty, and it being in particular proved by the testimony of Gabriel Varden that he had shown a special desire to take his life, he was committed for trial. Moreover, he was honoured with the distinction of being considered a chief among the insurgents, and received from the magistrate's lips the complimentary assurance that he was in a position of imminent danger, and would do well to prepare himself for the worst. To say that Mr. Dennis's modesty was not somewhat startled by these honours, or that he was altogether prepared for so flattering a reception, would be to claim for him a greater amount of stoical philosophy than even he possessed. Indeed, this gentleman's stoicism was of that not uncommon kind which enables a man to bear with exemplary fortitude the afflictions of his friends, but renders him, by way of counterpoise, rather selfish and sensitive in respect of any that happen to befall himself. It is therefore no disparagement to the great officer in question to state, without disguise or concealment, that he was at first very much alarmed, and that he betrayed divers emotions of fear, until his reasoning powers came to his relief, and set before him a more hopeful prospect. In proportion as Mr. Dennis exercised these intellectual qualities with which he was gifted, in reviewing his best chances of coming off handsomely and with small personal inconvenience, his spirits rose and his confidence increased. When he remembered the great estimation in which his office was held, and the constant demand for his services, when he bethought himself how the statute book regarded him as a kind of universal medicine, applicable to men, women, and children of every age and variety of criminal constitution, and how high he stood in his official capacity in the favour of the Crown, and both Houses of Parliament, the Mint, the Bank of England, and the judges of the land, when he recollected that whatever ministry was in or out, he remained their peculiar pet and panacea, and that for his sake England stood single and conspicuous among the civilized nations of the earth, when he called these things to mind and dwelt upon them, he felt certain that the national gratitude must relieve him from the consequences of his late proceedings, and would certainly restore him to his old place in the happy social system. With these crumbs, or as one may say, with these whole loaves of comfort to regale upon, Mr. Dennis took his place among the escort that awaited him, and repaired to jail with a manly indifference. Arriving at Newgate, where some of the ruined cells had been hastily fitted up for the safe keeping of rioters, he was warmly received by the turnkeys as an unusual and interesting case, which agreeably relieved their monotonous duties. In this spirit he was fettered with great care and conveyed into the interior of the prison. "Brother," cried the hangman, as, following an officer, he traversed under these novel circumstances the remains of passages with which he was well acquainted, "am I going to be along with anybody?" "If you'd have left more walls standing, you'd have been alone," was the reply. "As it is, we're cramped for room, and you'll have company." "Well," returned Dennis, "I don't object to company, brother. I rather like company. I was formed for society, I was." "That's rather a pity, ain't it?" said the man. "No," answered Dennis, "I'm not aware that it is. Why should it be a pity, brother?" "Oh, I don't know," said the man carelessly. "I thought that was what you meant. Being formed for society, and being cut off in your flower, you know." "I say," interposed the other quickly, "what are you talking of? Don't. Who's a going to be cut off in their flowers?" "Oh, nobody particular. I thought you was, perhaps," said the man. Mr Dennis wiped his face, which had suddenly grown very hot, and remarking in a tremulous voice to his conductor that he had always been fond of his joke, followed him in silence until he stopped at a door. "This is my quarters, is it?" he asked facetiously. "This is the shop, sir," replied his friend. He was walking in, but not with the best possible grace, when he suddenly stopped and started back. "Holloa!" said the officer. "You're nervous?" "Nervous!" whispered Dennis in great alarm. "Well, I may be. Shut the door." "I will, when you're in," returned the man. "But I can't go in there," whispered Dennis. "I can't be shut up with that man. Do you want me to be throttled, brother?" The officer seemed to entertain no particular desire on the subject one way or the other, but briefly remarking that he had his orders, and intended to obey them, pushed him in, turned the key, and retired. Dennis stood trembling, with his back against the door, and involuntarily raising his arm to defend himself, stared at a man, the only other tenant of the cell, who lay stretched at his full length upon a stone bench, and who paused in his deep breathing as if he were about to wake. But he rolled over on one side, let his arm fall negligently down, drew a long sigh, and murmuring indistinctly, fell fast asleep again. Relieved in some degree by this, the hangman took his eyes for an instant from the slumbering figure, and glanced round the cell in search of some vantage ground or weapon of defence. There was nothing movable within it, but a clumsy table which could not be displaced without noise, and a heavy chair. Stealing on tiptoe towards this latter piece of furniture, he retired with it into the remotest corner, and entrenching himself behind it, watched the enemy with the utmost vigilance and caution. The sleeping man was Hugh, and perhaps it was not unnatural for Dennis to feel in a state of very uncomfortable suspense, and to wish with his whole soul that he might never wake again. Tired of standing, he crouched down in the corner after some time, and rested on the cold pavement. But although Hugh's breathing still proclaimed that he was sleeping soundly, he could not trust him out of his sight for an instant. He was so afraid of him and of some sudden onslaught, that he was not content to see his closed eyes through the chair back, but every now and then rose stealthily to his feet, and peered at him with outstretched neck to assure himself that he really was still asleep, and was not about to spring upon him when he was off his guard. He slept so long and so soundly that Mr Dennis began to think he might sleep on until the turnkey visited them. He was congratulating himself upon these promising appearances, and blessing his stars with much fervour, when one or two unpleasant symptoms manifested themselves, such as another motion of the arm, another sigh, a restless tossing of the head. Then, just as it seemed that he was about to fall heavily to the ground from his narrow bed, Hugh's eyes opened. It happened that his face was turned directly towards his unexpected visitor. He looked lazily at him for some half dozen seconds, without any aspect of surprise or recognition, then suddenly jumped up, and with a great oath pronounced his name. "Keep off, brother, keep off!" cried Dennis, dodging behind the chair. "Don't do me a mischief. I'm a prisoner like you. I haven't the free use of my limbs. I'm quite an old man. Don't hurt me.' He whined out the last three words in such piteous accents, that Hugh, who had dragged away the chair and aimed a blow at him with it, checked himself and bade him get up. 'I'll get up, certainly, brother,' cried Dennis, anxious to propitiate himself by any means in his power. 'I'll comply with any request of yours, I'm sure. There, I'm up now. What can I do for you? Only say the word, and I'll do it.' 'What can you do for me?' cried Hugh, clutching him by the collar with both hands, and shaking him as though he were bent on stopping his breath by that means. 'What have you done for me?' 'The best that could be done,' returned the hangman. Hugh made him no answer, but shaking him in his strong grip until his teeth chattered in his head, cast him down upon the floor, and flung himself on the bench again. 'If it wasn't for the comfort it is to me to see you here,' he muttered, 'I'd have crushed your head against it, I would.' It was some time before Dennis had breath enough to speak, but as soon as he could resume his propitiatory strain, he did so. 'I did the best that could be done, brother,' he whined. 'I did indeed. I was forced with 2 bayonets, and I don't know how many bullets on each side of me to point you out. If you hadn't been taken, you'd have been shot, and what a sight that would have been, a fine young man like you.' 'Will it be a better sight now?' asked Hugh, raising his head with such a fierce expression that the other durst not answer him just then. 'A deal better,' said Dennis meekly, after a pause. 'First, there's all the chances of the law, and they're 500 strong. We may get off scot free. Unlikelier things than that have come to pass. Even if we shouldn't and the chances fail, we can be worked off once. And when it's well done, it's so neat, so skilful, so captiwating, that if that don't seem too strong a word, that you'd hardly believe it could be brought to such perfection. Kill one's fellow creeturs off with muskets? Pah!' And his nature so revolted at the bare idea that he spat upon the dungeon pavement. His warming on this topic, which to one unacquainted with his pursuits and tastes appeared like courage, together with his artful suppression of his own secret hopes, and mention of himself as being in the same condition with Hugh, did more to soothe that ruffian than the most elaborate arguments could have done, or the most abject submission. He rested his arms upon his knees, and stooping forward, looked from beneath his shaggy hair at Dennis, with something of a smile upon his face. 'The fact is, brother,' said the hangman in a tone of greater confidence, 'that you've got into bad company. The man that was with you was looked after more than you, and it was him I wanted. As to me, what have I got by it? Here we are, in one and the same plight.' 'Look'ee, rascal,' said Hugh, contracting his brows, 'I'm not altogether such a shallow blade, but I know you expected to get something by it, or you wouldn't have done it. But it's done, and you're here, and it will soon be all over with you and me, and I'd as soon die as live, or live as die. Why should I trouble myself to have revenge on you? To eat and drink and go to sleep, as long as I stay here, is all I care for. If there was but a little more sun to bask in than can find its way into this cursed place, I'd lie in it all day, and not trouble myself to sit or stand up once. That's all the care I have for myself. Why should I care for you?' Finishing this speech with a growl like the yawn of a wild beast, he stretched himself upon the bench again, and closed his eyes once more. After looking at him in silence for some moments, Dennis, who was greatly relieved to find him in this mood, drew the chair towards his rough couch and sat down near him, taking the precaution, however, to keep out of the range of his brawny arm. 'Well said, brother. Nothing could be better said,' he ventured to observe. 'We'll eat and drink of the best, and sleep our best, and make the best of it every way. Anything can be got for money. Let's spend it merrily.' 'Ay,' said Hugh, coiling himself into a new position. 'Where is it?' 'Well, they took mine from me at the lodge,' said Mr Dennis, 'but mine's a peculiar case.' 'Is it? They took mine too.' 'Why, then I tell you what, brother,' Dennis began, 'you must look up your friends.' 'My friends!' cried Hugh, starting up and resting on his hands. 'Where are my friends?' 'Your relations, then,' said Dennis. 'Ha ha ha!' laughed Dennis, waving one arm above his head. He talks of friends to me, talks of relations to a man whose mother died the death in store for her son, and left him, a hungry brat, without a face he knew in all the world. He talks of this to me!" "Brother," cried the hangman, whose features underwent a sudden change, "you don't mean to say—" "I mean to say," Hugh interposed, "that they hung her up at Tyburn. What was good enough for her is good enough for me. Let them do the like by me as soon as they please. The sooner the better. Say no more to me. I'm going to sleep." "But I want to speak to you. I want to hear more about that," said Dennis, changing colour.
"If you're a wise man," growled Hugh, raising his head to look at him with a frown, "you'll hold your tongue. I tell you I'm going to sleep."
Dennis venturing to say something more in spite of this caution, the desperate fellow struck at him with all his force, and missing him, lay down again with many muttered oaths and imprecations, and turned his face towards the wall. After two or three ineffectual twitches at his dress, which he was hardy enough to venture open, notwithstanding his dangerous humour, Mr Dennis, who burnt, for reasons of his own, to pursue the conversation, had no alternative but to sit as patiently as he could, waiting his further pleasure. Chapter 74. Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 75. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. Chapter 75. A month has elapsed, and we stand in the bedchamber of Sir John Chester. Through the half-opened window, the Temple garden looks green and pleasant. The placid river, gay with boat and barge, and dimpled with the plash of many an oar, sparkles in the distance. The sky is blue and clear, and the summer air steals gently in, filling the room with perfume. The very town, the smoky town, is radiant. High roofs and steeple tops, wont to look black and sullen, smile a cheerful grey. Every old gilded vane, and ball, and cross, glitters anew in the bright morning sun, and high above them all St. Paul's towers up, showing its lofty crest in burnished gold. Sir John was breakfasting in bed. His chocolate and toast stood upon a little table at his elbow. Books and newspapers lay ready to his hand upon the coverlet, and sometimes pausing to glance with an air of tranquil satisfaction round the well-ordered room, and sometimes to gaze indolently at the summer sky, he ate and drank, and read the news luxuriously. The cheerful influence of the morning seemed to have some effect even on his equable temper. His manner was unusually gay, his smile more placid and agreeable than usual, his voice more clear and pleasant. He laid down the newspaper he had been reading, leaned back upon his pillow with the air of one who resigned himself to a train of charming recollections, and after a pause soliloquized as follows: "And my friend the Centaur goes the way of his mamma. I am not surprised. And his mysterious friend Mr Dennis likewise. I am not surprised. And my old postman, the exceedingly free and easy young madman of Chigwell. I am quite rejoiced. It's the very best thing that could possibly happen to him." After delivering himself of these remarks, he fell again into his smiling train of reflection, from which he roused himself at length to finish his chocolate, which was getting cold, and ring the bell for more. The new supply arriving, he took his cup from his servant's hand, and saying, with a charmable affability, "I am so obliged to you, Peak," dismissed him. "It is a remarkable circumstance," he mused, dallying lazily with the teaspoon, "that my friend the madman should have been within an ace of escaping on his trial, and it was a good stroke of chance, or as the world would say, a providential occurrence, that the brother of my Lord Mayor should have been in court with other country justices, into whose very dense heads curiosity had penetrated. For though the brother of my Lord Mayor was decidedly wrong, and established his near relationship to that amusing person beyond all doubt, in stating that my friend was sane, and had, to his knowledge, wandered about the country with a vagabond parent, avowing revolutionary and rebellious sentiments, I am not the least obliged to him for volunteering that evidence. These insane creatures make such very odd and embarrassing remarks that they really ought to be hanged for the comfort of society." The country justice had indeed turned the wavering scale against poor Barnaby, and solved the doubt that trembled in his favour. Grip little thought how much he had to answer for. "They will be a singular party," said Sir John, leaning his head upon his hand, and sipping his chocolate. "A very curious party. The hangman himself, the centaur, and the madman. The centaur would make a very handsome preparation in Surgeons' Hall, and would benefit science extremely. I hope they have taken care to bespeak him. Peak, I am not at home, of course, to anybody but the hairdresser." This reminder to his servant was called forth by a knock at the door, which the man hastened to open. After a prolonged murmur of question and answer, he returned, and as he cautiously closed the room door behind him, a man was heard to cough in the passage. "Now, it is of no use, Peak," said Sir John, raising his hand in deprecation of his delivering any message. "I am not at home. I cannot possibly hear you. I told you I was not at home, and my word is sacred. Will you never do as you are desired?" Having nothing to oppose to this reproof, the man was about to withdraw, when the visitor who had given occasion to it, probably rendered impatient by delay, knocked with his knuckles at the chamber door, and called out that he had urgent business with Sir John Chester, which admitted of no delay. "Let him in," said Sir John. "My good fellow," he added when the door was open, "how come you to intrude yourself in this extraordinary manner upon the privacy of a gentleman? How can you be so wholly destitute of self-respect as to be guilty of such remarkable ill-breeding?" "My business, Sir John, is not of a common kind, I do assure you," returned the person he addressed. "If I have taken any uncommon course to get admission to you, I hope I shall be pardoned on that account." "Well, we shall see, we shall see," returned Sir John, whose face cleared up when he saw who it was, and whose prepossessing smile was now restored. "I am sure we have met before," he added in his winning tone, "but really I forget your name." "My name is Gabriel Varden, sir." "Varden, of course, Varden," returned Sir John, tapping his forehead. "Dear me, how very defective my memory becomes! Varden, to be sure. Mr Varden the locksmith. You have a charming wife, Mr Varden, and a most beautiful daughter. They are well?" Gabriel thanked him, and said they were. "I rejoice to hear it," said Sir John. "Commend me to them when you return, and say that I wished I were fortunate enough to convey, myself, the salute which I entrust you to deliver. And what," he asked very sweetly, after a moment's pause, "can I do for you? You may command me freely." "I thank you, Sir John," said Gabriel, with some pride in his manner, "but I have come to ask no favour of you, though I come on business private," he added, with a glance at the man who stood looking on, "and very pressing business." "I cannot say you are the more welcome for being independent and having nothing to ask of me," returned Sir John graciously, "for I should have been very happy to render you a service. Still, you are welcome on any terms. Oblige me with some more chocolate, Peak, and don't wait." The man retired, and left them alone. "Sir John," said Gabriel, "I am a working man, and have been so all my life. If I don't prepare you enough for what I have to tell, if I come to the point too abruptly, and give you a shock which a gentleman could have spared you, or at all events lessened very much, I hope you will give me credit for meaning well. I wish to be careful and considerate, and I trust that in a straightforward person like me you'll take the will for the deed." "Mr Varden," returned the other, perfectly composed under this exordium, "I beg you'll take a chair. Chocolate, perhaps, you don't relish? Well, it is an acquired taste, no doubt?" "Sir John," said Gabriel, who had acknowledged with a bow the invitation to be seated, but had not availed himself of it, "Sir John," he dropped his voice and drew nearer to the bed, "I am just now come from Newgate." "Good Gad!" cried Sir John, hastily sitting up in bed. "From Newgate, Mr Varden! How could you be so very imprudent as to come from Newgate? Newgate, where there are jail fevers, and ragged people, and barefooted men and women, and 1,000 horrors. Peak, bring the camphor, quick.
Heaven and earth, Mr Varden, my dear good soul, how could you come from Newgate?' Gabriel returned no answer, but looked on in silence while Peak, who had entered with the hot chocolate, ran to a drawer and returned with a bottle, sprinkled his master's dressing gown and the bedding, and besides moistened the locksmith himself plentifully, described a circle round about him on the carpet. When he had done this he again retired, and Sir John, reclining in an easy attitude upon his pillow, once more turned a smiling face towards his visitor. 'You will forgive me, Mr Varden, I am sure, for being at first a little sensitive both on your account and my own. I confess I was startled, notwithstanding your delicate exordium. Might I ask you to do me the favour not to approach any nearer? You really have come from Newgate?' The locksmith inclined his head. 'Indeed! And now, Mr Varden, all exaggeration and embellishment apart,' said Sir John Chester confidentially, as he sipped his chocolate, 'what kind of place is Newgate?' 'A strange place, Sir John,' returned the locksmith, 'of a sad and doleful kind. A strange place where many strange things are heard and seen, but few more strange than I come to tell you of. The case is urgent. I am sent here. Not not from the jail. Yes, Sir John, from the jail. And my good credulous open hearted friend,' said Sir John, setting down his cup and laughing, 'by whom?' 'By a man called Dennis. For many years the hangman, and to-morrow morning the hanged,' returned the locksmith. Sir John had expected, had been quite certain from the first, that he would say he had come from Hugh, and was prepared to meet him on that point. But this answer occasioned him a degree of astonishment, which for the moment he could not, with all his command of feature, prevent his face from expressing. He quickly subdued it, however, and said in the same light tone, 'And what does the gentleman require of me? My memory may be at fault again, but I don't recollect that I ever had the pleasure of an introduction to him, or that I ever numbered him among my personal friends, I do assure you, Mr Varden.' 'Sir John,' returned the locksmith gravely, 'I will tell you, as nearly as I can, in the words he used to me, what he desires that you should know, and what you ought to know without a moment's loss of time.' Sir John Chester settled himself in a position of greater repose, and looked at his visitor with an expression of face which seemed to say, 'This is an amusing fellow. I'll hear him out.' 'You may have seen in the newspapers, sir,' said Gabriel, pointing to the one which lay by his side, 'that I was a witness against this man upon his trial some days since, and that it was not his fault I was alive and able to speak to what I knew.' 'May have seen!' cried Sir John. 'My dear Mr Varden, you are quite a public character, and live in all men's thoughts most deservedly. Nothing can exceed the interest with which I read your testimony, and remembered that I had the pleasure of a slight acquaintance with you. I hope we shall have your portrait published?' 'This morning, sir,' said the locksmith, taking no notice of these compliments, 'early this morning a message was brought to me from Newgate, at this man's request, desiring that I would go and see him, for he had something particular to communicate. I needn't tell you that he is no friend of mine, and that I had never seen him until the rioters beset my house.' Sir John fanned himself gently with the newspaper, and nodded. 'I knew, however, from the general report,' resumed Gabriel, 'that the order for his execution to-morrow went down to the prison last night, and looking upon him as a dying man, I complied with his request.' 'You are quite a Christian, Mr Varden,' said Sir John, 'and in that amiable capacity you increase my desire that you should take a chair. He said,' continued Gabriel, looking steadily at the knight, 'that he had sent to me, because he had no friend or companion in the whole world, being the common hangman, and because he believed, from the way in which I had given my evidence, that I was an honest man, and would act truly by him. He said that, being shunned by every one who knew his calling, even by people of the lowest and most wretched grade and finding, when he joined the rioters, that the men he acted with had no suspicion of it, which I believe is true enough, for a poor fool of an old 'prentice of mine was one of them. He had kept his own counsel up to the time of his being taken and put in jail.' 'Very discreet of Mr Dennis,' observed Sir John with a slight yawn, though still with the utmost affability. 'But except for your admirable and lucid manner of telling it, which is perfect, not very interesting to me.' 'When,' pursued the locksmith, quite unabashed and wholly regardless of these interruptions, 'when he was taken to the jail, he found that his fellow prisoner in the same room was a young man, Hugh by name, a leader in the riots, who had been betrayed and given up by himself. From something which fell from this unhappy creature in the course of the angry words they had at meeting, he discovered that his mother had suffered the death to which they both are now condemned. The time is very short, Sir John.' The knight laid down his paper fan, replaced his cup upon the table at his side, and saving for the smile that lurked about his mouth, looked at the locksmith with as much steadiness as the locksmith looked at him. 'They have been in prison now a month. One conversation led to many more, and the hangman soon found, from a comparison of time and place and dates, that he had executed the sentence of the law upon this woman himself. She had been tempted by want, as so many people are, into the easy crime of passing forged notes. She was young and handsome, and the traders who employ men, women, and children in this traffic looked upon her as one who was well adapted for their business, and who would probably go on without suspicion for a long time. But they were mistaken, for she was stopped in the commission of her very first offence, and died for it. She was of gipsy blood, Sir John.' It might have been the effect of a passing cloud which obscured the sun, and cast a shadow on his face, but the knight turned deadly pale. Still he met the locksmith's eye as before. 'She was of gipsy blood, Sir John,' repeated Gabriel, 'and had a high free spirit. This, and her good looks, and her lofty manner, interested some gentlemen who were easily moved by dark eyes, and efforts were made to save her. They might have been successful if she would have given them any clue to her history, but she never would or did. There was reason to suspect that she would make an attempt upon her life. A watch was set upon her night and day, and from that time she never spoke again.' Sir John stretched out his hand towards his cup. The locksmith, going on, arrested it half way. 'Until she had but a minute to live. Then she broke silence, and said in a low, firm voice, which no one heard but this executioner, for all other living creatures had retired and left her to her fate, 'If I had a dagger within these fingers, and he was within my reach, I would strike him dead before me, even now.' The man asked, 'Who?' She said, 'The father of her boy.' Sir John drew back his outstretched hand, and seeing that the locksmith paused, signed to him with easy politeness, and without any new appearance of emotion, to proceed. It was the first word she had ever spoken, from which it could be understood that she had any relative on earth. Was the child alive, he asked. Yes. He asked her where it was, its name, and whether she had any wish respecting it. She had but one, she said. It was that the boy might live and grow in utter ignorance of his father, so that no arts might teach him to be gentle and forgiving. When he becomes a man, she trusted to the God of their tribe to bring the father and the son together, and revenge her through her child. He asked her other questions, but she spoke no more. Indeed, he says she scarcely said this much to him, but stood with her face turned upwards toward the sky, and never looked towards him once. Sir John took a pinch of snuff, glanced approvingly at an elegant little sketch entitled Nature on the wall, and raising his eyes to the locksmith's face again, said with an air of courtesy and patronage, 'You were observing, Mr Varden, that she never,' returned the locksmith, who was not to be diverted by any artifice from his firm manner, and his steady gaze, 'that she never looked towards him once, Sir John. And so she died, and he forgot her. But some years afterwards a man was sentenced to die the same death, who was a gipsy too, a sunburnt, swarthy fellow, almost a wild man. And while he lay in prison under sentence, he, who had seen the hangman more than once while he was free, cut an image of him on his stick, by way of braving death, and showing those who attended on him how little he cared or thought about it. He gave this stick into his hands at Tyburn, and told him then that the woman I have spoken of had left her own people to join a fine gentleman, and that by being deserted by him and cast off by her old friends, she had sworn within her own proud breast that whatever her misery might be, she would ask no help of any human being. He told him that she had kept her word to the last, and that meeting even him in the streets, he had been fond of her once, it seemed. She had slipped from him by a trick, and he never saw her again, until, being in one of the frequent crowds at Tyburn with some of his rough companions, he had been driven almost mad by seeing in the criminal under another name, whose death he had come to witness herself. Standing in the same place in which she had stood, he told the hangman this, and told him too her real name, which only her own people and the gentleman for whose sake she had left them knew. That name he will tell again, Sir John, to none but you.' 'To none but me!' exclaimed the knight, pausing in the act of raising his cup to his lips with a perfectly steady hand, and curling up his little finger for the better display of a brilliant ring with which it was ornamented. 'But me! My dear Mr Varden, how very preposterous to select me for his confidence! With you at his elbow too, who are so perfectly trustworthy!' 'Sir John, Sir John,' returned the locksmith, 'at 12 to-morrow these men die. Hear the few words I have to add, and do not hope to deceive me; for though I am a plain man of humble station, and you are a gentleman of rank and learning, the truth raises me to your level, and I know that you anticipate the disclosure with which I am about to end, and that you believe this doomed man, Hugh, to be your son.' 'Nay,' said Sir John, badgering him with a gay air, 'the wild gentleman who died so suddenly scarcely went so far as that, I think.' 'He did not,' returned the locksmith, 'for she had bound him by some pledge known only to these people, and which the worst among them respect, not to tell your name. But in a fantastic pattern on the stick he had carved some letters, and when the hangman asked it, he bade him, especially, if he should ever meet with her son in after life, remember that place well.' 'What place?' 'Chester.' The knight finished his cup of chocolate with an appearance of infinite relish, and carefully wiped his lips upon his handkerchief. 'Sir John,' said the locksmith, 'this is all that has been told to me. But since these two men have been left for death, they have conferred together closely. See them, and hear what they can add. See this Dennis, and learn from him what he has not trusted to me. If you, who hold the clue to all, want corroboration, which you do not, the means are easy.' 'And to what,' said Sir John Chester, rising on his elbow after smoothing the pillow for its reception, 'my dear, good natured, estimable Mr Varden, with whom I cannot be angry if I would, to what does all this tend?' 'I take you for a man, Sir John, and I suppose it tends to some pleading of natural affection in your breast,' returned the locksmith. 'I suppose to the straining of every nerve, and the exertion of all the influence you have, or can make, in behalf of your miserable son, and the man who has disclosed his existence to you. At the worst, I suppose to your seeing your son, and awakening him to a sense of his crime and danger. He has no such sense now. Think what his life must have been, when he said, in my hearing, that if I moved you to anything, it would be to hastening his death, and ensuring his silence, if you had it in your power. And have you, my good Mr Varden,' said Sir John, in a tone of mild reproof, 'have you really lived to your present age, and remained so very simple and credulous as to approach a gentleman of established character with such credentials as these, from desperate men in their last extremity, catching at any straw? Oh dear! Oh fie, fie!' The locksmith was going to interpose, but he stopped him. 'On any other subject, Mr Varden, I shall be delighted, I shall be charmed to converse with you, but I owe it to my own character not to pursue this topic for another moment.' 'Think better of it, sir, when I am gone,' returned the locksmith. 'Think better of it, sir. Although you have, thrice within as many weeks, turned your lawful son, Mr Edward, from your door, you may have time, you may have years, to make your peace with him, Sir John, but that 12 o'clock will soon be here, and soon be past for ever. I thank you very much, returned the knight, kissing his delicate hand to the locksmith, for your guileless advice, and I only wish, my good soul, although your simplicity is quite captivating, that you had a little more worldly wisdom. I never so much regretted the arrival of my hairdresser as I do at this moment. God bless you. Good morning. You'll not forget my message to the ladies, Mr. Varden. Peak, show Mr. Varden to the door. Gabriel said no more, but gave the knight a parting look and left him. As he quitted the room, Sir John's face changed, and the smile gave place to a haggard and anxious expression, like that of a weary actor jaded by the performance of a difficult part. He rose from his bed with a heavy sigh, and wrapped himself in his morning gown. So she kept her word, he said, and was constant to her threat. I would I had never seen that dark face of hers. I might have read these consequences in it from the first. This affair would make a noise abroad if it rested on better evidence, but as it is, and by not joining the scattered links of the chain, I can afford to slight it. Extremely distressing to be the parent of such an uncouth creature. Still, I gave him very good advice. I told him he would certainly be hanged. I told him he would certainly be hanged. I could have done no more if I had known of our relationship, and there are a great many fathers who have never done as much for their natural children. The hairdresser may come in, Peak. The hairdresser came in, and saw in Sir John Chester, whose accommodating conscience was soon quieted by the numerous precedents that occurred to him in support of his last observation, the same imperturbable, fascinating, elegant gentleman that he had seen yesterday, and many yesterdays before.
End of chapter 75. Barnaby Rudge, chapter 76. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, chapter 76. As the locksmith walked slowly away from Sir John Chester's chambers, he lingered under the trees which shaded the path, almost hoping that he might be summoned to return. He had turned back thrice, and still loitered at the corner when the clock struck 12. It was a solemn sound, and not merely for its reference to tomorrow, for he knew that in that chime the murderer's knell was rung. He had seen him pass along the crowded street amidst the execration of the throng, and marked his quivering lip and trembling limbs, the ashy hue upon his face, his clammy brow, the wild distraction of his eye, the fear of death that swallowed up all other thoughts, and gnawed without cessation at his heart and brain. He had marked the wandering look, seeking for hope, and finding, turn where it would, despair. He had seen the remorseful, pitiful, desolate creature riding, with his coffin by his side, to the gibbet. He knew that to the last he had been an unyielding, obdurate man, that in the savage terror of his condition he had hardened, rather than relented, to his wife and child, and that the last words which had passed his white lips were curses on them as his enemies. Mr Haredale had determined to be there, and see it done. Nothing but the evidence of his own senses could satisfy that gloomy thirst for retribution which had been gathering upon him for so many years. The locksmith knew this, and when the chimes had ceased to vibrate, hurried away to meet him. "For these two men," he said as he went, "I can do no more. Heaven have mercy on them. Alas, I say I can do no more for them, but whom can I help? Mary Rudge will have a home and a firm friend when she most wants one. But Barnaby, poor Barnaby, willing Barnaby, what aid can I render him? There are many, many men of sense, God forgive me," cried the honest locksmith, stopping in a narrow court to pass his hand across his eyes. "I could better afford to lose than Barnaby. We have always been good friends, but I never knew till now how much I loved the lad." There were not many in the great city who thought of Barnaby that day otherwise than as an actor in a show which was to take place tomorrow, but if the whole population had had him in their minds, and had wished his life to be spared, not one among them could have done so with a purer zeal or greater singleness of heart than the good locksmith. Barnaby was to die. There was no hope. It is not the least evil attendant upon the frequent exhibition of this last dread punishment of death, that it hardens the minds of those who deal it out, and makes them, though they be amiable men in other respects, indifferent to, or unconscious of, their great responsibility. The word had gone forth that Barnaby was to die. It went forth every month for lighter crimes. It was a thing so common that very few were startled by the awful sentence, or cared to question its propriety. Just then, too, when the law had been so flagrantly outraged, its dignity must be asserted. The symbol of its dignity, stamped upon every page of the criminal statute book, was the gallows, and Barnaby was to die. They had tried to save him. The locksmith had carried petitions and memorials to the fountain head with his own hands, but the well was not one of mercy, and Barnaby was to die. From the first, his mother had never left him save at night, and with her beside him he was as usual contented. On this last day he was more elated and more proud than he had been yet, and when she dropped the book she had been reading to him aloud, and fell upon his neck, he stopped in his busy task of folding a piece of crape about his hat, and wondered at her anguish. Grip uttered a feeble croak, half in encouragement it seemed, and half in remonstrance, but he wanted heart to sustain it, and lapsed abruptly into silence. With them who stood upon the brink of the great gulf which none can see beyond, time, so soon to lose itself in vast eternity, rolled on like a mighty river, swollen and rapid as it nears the sea. It was morning but now. They had sat and talked together in a dream, and here was evening. The dreadful hour of separation, which even yesterday had seemed so distant, was at hand. They walked out into the courtyard, clinging to each other, but not speaking. Barnaby knew that the jail was a dull, sad, miserable place, and looked forward to tomorrow as to a passage from it to something bright and beautiful. He had a vague impression, too, that he was expected to be brave, that he was a man of great consequence, and that the prison people would be glad to make him weep. He trod the ground more firmly as he thought of this, and bade her take heart and cry no more, and feel how steady his hand was. They call me silly, mother. They shall see tomorrow. Dennis and Hugh were in the courtyard. Hugh came forth from his cell as they did, stretched himself as though he had been sleeping. Dennis sat upon a bench in a corner, with his knees and chin huddled together, and rocked himself to and fro like a person in severe pain. The mother and son remained on one side of the court, and these two men upon the other. Hugh strode up and down, glancing fiercely every now and then at the bright summer sky, and looking round when he had done so at the walls. No reprieve, no reprieve. Nobody comes near us. There's only the night left now, moaned Dennis faintly, as he wrung his hands. Do you think they'll reprieve me in the night, brother? I've known reprieves come in the night afore now. I've known him come as late as 5, 6, and 7 o'clock in the morning. Don't you think there's a good chance yet? Don't you? Say you do. Say you do, young man, whined the miserable creature with an imploring gesture towards Barnaby, or I shall go mad. Better be mad than sane here, said Hugh. Go mad. But tell me what you think. Somebody tell me what he thinks, cried the wretched object, so mean and wretched and despicable that even Pity's self might have turned away at sight of such a being in the likeness of a man. Isn't there a chance for me? Isn't there a good chance for me? Isn't it likely they may be doing this to frighten me? Don't you think it is? Oh, he almost shrieked as he wrung his hands, won't anybody give me comfort? You ought to be the best instead of the worst, said Hugh, stopping before him. Ha ha ha! See the hangman when it comes home to him. You don't know what it is, cried Dennis, actually writhing as he spoke. I do. That I should come to be worked off. I, that I should come. And why not? Said Hugh, as he thrust back his matted hair to get a better view of his late associate. How often before I knew your trade did I hear you talking of this as if it was a treat? I ain't unconsistent, screamed the miserable creature. I'd talk so again if I was hangman. Some other man has got my old opinions at this minute. That makes it worse. Somebody's longing to work me off. I know by myself that somebody must be. He'll soon have his longing, said Hugh, resuming his walk. Think of that, and be quiet. although one of these men displayed in his speech and bearing the most reckless hardihood, and the other in his every word and action testified such an extreme of abject cowardice that it was humiliating to see him, it would be difficult to say which of them would most have repelled and shocked an observer. Hugh's was the dogged desperation of a savage at the stake. The hangman was reduced to a condition little better, if any, than that of a hound with the halter round his neck. Yet, as Mr Dennis knew, and could have told them, these were the two commonest states of mind in persons brought to their pass. Such was the wholesome growth of the seed sown by the law, that this kind of harvest was usually looked for as a matter of course. In one respect they all agreed. The wandering and uncontrollable train of thought, suggesting sudden recollections of things distant and long forgotten, and remote from each other; the vague restless craving for something undefined which nothing could satisfy; the swift flight of the minutes, fusing themselves into hours as if by enchantment; the rapid coming of the solemn night; the shadow of death always upon them, and yet so dim and faint that objects the meanest and most trivial started from the gloom beyond, and forced themselves upon the view; the impossibility of holding the mind, even if they had been so disposed, to penitence and preparation, or of keeping it to any point while one hideous fascination tempted it away; these things were common to them all, and varied only in their outward tokens. 'Fetch me the book I left within, upon your bed,' she said to Barnaby as the clock struck. 'Kiss me first.' He looked in her face, and saw there that the time was come. After a long embrace, he tore himself away, and ran to bring it to her, bidding her not stir till he came back. He soon returned, for a shriek recalled him, but she was gone. He ran to the yard gate and looked through. They were carrying her away. She had said that her heart would break. It was better so. 'Don't you think,' whimpered Dennis, creeping up to him as he stood with his feet rooted to the ground, gazing at the blank walls, 'don't you think there's still a chance? It's a dreadful end. It's a terrible end for a man like me. Don't you think there's a chance? I don't mean for you, I mean for me. Don't let him hear us,' meaning Hugh. 'He's so desperate.' 'Now then,' said the officer, who had been lounging in and out with his hands in his pockets, and yawning as if he were in the last extremity for some subject of interest, 'it's time to turn in, boys.' 'Not yet,' cried Dennis, 'not yet. Not for an hour yet.' 'I say, your watch goes different from what it used to,' returned the man. 'Once upon a time it was always too fast. It's got the other fault now.' 'My friend,' cried the wretched creature, falling on his knees, 'my dear friend, you always were my friend, there's some mistake, some letter has been mislaid, or some messenger has been stopped upon the way, he may have fallen dead. I saw a man once fall down dead in the street myself, and he had papers in his pocket. Send to inquire, let somebody go to inquire. They never will hang me, they never can. Yes, they will,' he cried, starting to his feet with a terrible scream. 'They'll hang me by a trick, and keep the pardon back. It's a plot against me. I shall lose my life,' and uttering another yell, he fell in a fit upon the ground. 'See the hangman when it comes home to him,' cried Hugh again, as they bore him away. 'Ha ha ha! Courage, bold Barnaby, what care we? Your hand. They do well to put us out of the world, for if we got loose a second time we wouldn't let them off so easy, eh? Another shake. A man can die but once. If you wake in the night, sing that out lustily, and fall asleep again. Ha ha ha!' Barnaby glanced once more through the grate into the empty yard, and then watched Hugh as he strode to the steps leading to his sleeping cell. He heard him shout, and burst into a roar of laughter, and saw him flourish his hat. Then he turned away himself, like one who walked in his sleep, without any sense of fear or sorrow, lay down on his pallet, listening for the clock to strike again. Chapter 76. Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 77. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge, by Charles Dickens, Chapter 77. The time wore on. The noises in the street became less frequent by degrees, until silence was scarcely broken, save by the bells in church towers marking the progress, softer and more stealthy while the city slumbered, of the Great Watcher with the hoary head, who never sleeps or rests. In the brief interval of darkness and repose which feverish towns enjoy, all busy sounds were hushed, and those who awoke from dreams lay listening in their beds, and longed for dawn, and wished the dead of the night were past. Into the street outside the jail's main wall, workmen came straggling at this solemn hour in groups of 2 or 3, and meeting in the centre, cast their tools upon the ground and spoke in whispers. Others soon issued from the jail itself, bearing on their shoulders planks and beams. These materials being all brought forth, the rest bestirred themselves, and the dull sound of hammers began to echo through the stillness. Here and there among this knot of labourers, one, with a lantern or a smoky link, stood by to light his fellows at their work, and by its doubtful aid some might be dimly seen taking up the pavement of the road, while others held great upright posts, or fixed them in the holes thus made for their reception. Some dragged slowly on towards the rest, an empty cart, which they brought rumbling from the prison yard, while others erected strong barriers across the street. All were busily engaged, their dusky figures moving to and fro, at that unusual hour so active and so silent, might have been taken for those of shadowy creatures toiling at midnight on some ghostly unsubstantial work, which, like themselves, would vanish with the first gleam of day, and leave but morning mist and vapour. While it was yet dark, a few lookers on collected, who had plainly come there for the purpose and intended to remain. Even those who had to pass the spot on their way to some other place, lingered and lingered yet, as though the attraction of that were irresistible. Meanwhile the noise of saw and mallet went on briskly, mingled with the clattering of boards on the stone pavement of the road, and sometimes with the workmen's voices as they called to one another. Whenever the chimes of the neighbouring church were heard, and that was every quarter of an hour, a strange sensation, instantaneous and indescribable, but perfectly obvious, seemed to pervade them all. Gradually a faint brightness appeared in the east, and the air, which had been very warm all through the night, felt cool and chilly. Though there was no daylight yet, the darkness was diminished, and the stars looked pale. The prison, which had been a mere black mass with little shape or form, put on its usual aspect, and ever and anon a solitary watchman could be seen upon its roof, stopping to look down upon the preparations in the street. This man, from forming as it were a part of the jail, and knowing or being supposed to know all that was passing within, became an object of as much interest, and was as eagerly looked for, and as awfully pointed out, as if he had been a spirit. By and by, the feeble light grew stronger, and the houses with their signboards and inscriptions stood plainly out in the dull grey morning. Heavy stage wagons crawled from the inn-yard opposite, and travellers peeped out, and as they rolled sluggishly away, cast many a backward look towards the jail. And now the sun's first beams came glancing into the street, and the night's work, which in its various stages and in the varied fancies of the lookers on had taken 100 shapes, wore its own proper form, a scaffold and a gibbet. As the warmth of the cheerful day began to shed itself upon the scanty crowd, the murmur of tongues was heard, shutters were thrown open, and blinds drawn up, and those who had slept in rooms over against the prison, where places to see the execution were let at high prices, rose hastily from their beds. In some of the houses people were busy taking out the window sashes for the better accommodation of spectators. In others, the spectators were already seated, and beguiling the time with cards or drink or jokes among themselves. Some had purchased seats upon the housetops, and were already crawling to their stations from parapet and garret window. Some were yet bargaining for good places, and stood in them in a state of indecision, gazing at the slowly swelling crowd, and at the workmen as they rested listlessly against the scaffold,
affecting to listen with indifference to the proprietor's eulogy of the commanding views his house afforded, and the surprising cheapness of his terms. A fairer morning never shone. From the roofs and upper stories of these buildings, the spires of city churches, and the great cathedral dome were visible, rising up beyond the prison into the blue sky, and clad in the colour of light summer clouds, and showing in the clear atmosphere that their every scrap of tracery and fretwork, and every niche and loophole, all were brightness and promise, excepting in the street below, into which, for it yet lay in shadow, the eye looked down as into a dark trench, where, in the midst of so much life and hope, and renewal of existence, stood the terrible instrument of death. It seemed as if the very sun forbore to look upon it. But it was better, grim and sombre in the shade, than when, the day being more advanced, it stood confessed in the full glare and glory of the sun, with its black paint blistering, and its nooses dangling in the light like loathsome garlands. It was better in the solitude and gloom of midnight, with a few forms clustering about it, than in the freshness and the stir of morning, the centre of an eager crowd. It was better haunting the street like a spectre, when men were in their beds, and influencing perchance the city's dreams, than braving the broad day and thrusting its obscene presence upon their waking senses. 5 o'clock had struck, 6, 7, and 8. Along the two main streets at either end of the crossway, a living stream had now set in, rolling towards the marts of gain and business. Carts, coaches, waggons, trucks, and barrows forced a passage through the outskirts of the throng, and clattered onward in the same direction. Some of these, which were public conveyances, and had come from a short distance in the country, stopped, and the driver pointed to the gibbet with his whip, though he might have spared himself the pains, for the heads of all the passengers were turned that way without his help, and the coach windows were struck full of staring eyes. In some of the carts and waggons women might be seen, glancing fearfully at the same unsightly thing, and even little children were held up above the people's heads to see what kind of a toy the gallows was, and learn how men were hanged. 2 rioters were to die before the prison, who had been concerned in the attack, and one directly afterwards in Bloomsbury Square. At 9 o'clock, a strong body of military marched into the street, and formed and lined a narrow passage into Holborn, which had been indifferently kept all night by constables. Through this, another cart was brought (the one already mentioned had been employed in the construction of the scaffold), and wheeled up to the prison gate. These preparations made, the soldiers stood at ease. The officers lounged to and fro, in the alley they had made, or talked together at the scaffold's foot, and the concourse, which had been rapidly augmenting for some hours, and still received additions every minute, waited with an impatience which increased with every chime of St. Sepulchre's clock from 12 at noon. Up to this time they had been very quiet, comparatively silent, save when the arrival of some new party at a window, hitherto unoccupied, gave them something new to look at, or to talk of. But as the hour approached, a buzz and hum arose, which, deepening every moment, soon swelled into a roar, and seemed to fill the air. No words, or even voices, could be distinguished in this clamour, nor did they speak much to each other, though such as were better informed upon the topic than the rest would tell their neighbours, perhaps, that they might know the hangman when he came out, by his being the shorter one, and that the man who was to suffer with him was named Hugh, and that it was Barnaby Rudge who would be hanged in Bloomsbury Square. The hum grew as the time drew near, so loud that those who were at the windows could not hear the church clock strike, though it was close at hand. Nor had they any need to hear it either, for they could see it in the people's faces. So surely as another quarter chimed, there was a movement in the crowd, as if something had passed over it, as if the light upon them had been changed, in which the fact was readable as on a brazen dial figured by a giant's hand. 3/4 past 11. The murmur now was deafening, yet every man seemed mute. Look where you would among the crowd, you saw strained eyes and lips compressed,
It would have been difficult for the most vigilant observer to point this way or that, and say that yonder man had cried out. It were as easy to detect the motion of lips in a sea shell. 3/4 past 11. Many spectators who had retired from the windows came back refreshed as though their watch had just begun. Those who had fallen asleep roused themselves, and every person in the crowd made one last effort to better his position, which caused a press against the sturdy barriers that made them bend and yield like twigs. The officers, who until now had kept together, fell into their several positions, and gave the words of command. Swords were drawn, muskets shouldered, and the bright steel, winding its way among the crowd, gleamed and glittered in the sun like a river. Along this shining path, two men came hurrying on, leading a horse, which was speedily harnessed to the cart at the prison door. Then a profound silence replaced the tumult that had so long been gathering, and a breathless pause ensued. Every window was now choked up with heads. The housetops teemed with people, clinging to chimneys, peering over gable ends, and holding on where the sudden loosening of any brick or stone would dash them down into the street. The church tower, the church roof, the churchyard, the prison leads, the very water spouts and lamp posts, every inch of room swarmed with human life. At the first stroke of 12 the prison bell began to toll. Then the roar, mingled now with cries of hats off and poor fellows, and from some specks in the great concourse, with a shriek or groan, burst forth again. It was terrible to see. If any one in that distraction of excitement could have seen, the world of eager eyes, all strained upon the scaffold and the beam. The hollow murmuring was heard within the jail as plainly as without. The three were brought forth into the yard, together, as it resounded through the air. They knew its import well.
D'ye hear?
Cried Hugh, undaunted by the sound.
They expect us. I heard them gathering when I woke in the night, and I turned over on t'other side, and fell asleep again. We shall see how they welcome the hangman now that it comes home to him. Ha ha ha!
The ordinary coming up at this moment reproved him for his indecent mirth, and advised him to alter his demeanour.
And why, master? Said Hugh. Can I do better than bear it easily? You bear it easily enough. Oh, never tell me, he cried, as the other would have spoken. For all your sad look and your solemn air, you think little enough of it. They say you're the best maker of lobster salads in London. Ha ha! I've heard that, you see, before now. Is it a good one this morning? Is your hand in? How does the breakfast look? I hope there's enough and to spare for all this hungry company that'll sit down to it when the sight's over.
I fear, observed the clergyman, shaking his head, that you are incorrigible.
You're right I am, rejoined Hugh sternly. Be no hypocrite, master. You make a merry-making of this. Every month let me be merry too. If you want a frightened fellow, there's one that'll suit you. Try your hand upon him.
He pointed as he spoke to Dennis, who, with his legs trailing on the ground, was held between two men, and who trembled so that all his joints and limbs seemed racked by spasms. Turning from this wretched spectacle, he called to Barnaby, who stood apart.
What cheer, Barnaby? Don't be downcast, lad. Leave that to him.
Bless you, cried Barnaby, stepping lightly towards him. I'm not frightened, Hugh. I'm quite happy. I wouldn't desire to live now if they'd let me. Look at me. Am I afraid to die? Will they see me tremble? Hugh gazed for a moment at his face, on which there was a strange unearthly smile, and at his eye, which sparkled brightly, and interposing between him and the ordinary, gruffly whispered to the latter.
I wouldn't say much to him, master, if I was you. He may spoil your appetite for breakfast, though you are used to it.
He was the only one of the three who had washed or trimmed himself that morning. Neither of the others had done so since their doom was pronounced. He still wore the broken peacock's feathers in his hat, and all his usual scraps of finery were carefully disposed about his person. His kindling eye, his firm step, his proud and resolute bearing, might have graced some lofty act of heroism, some voluntary sacrifice, born of a noble cause and pure enthusiasm, rather than that felon's death. But all these things increased his guilt. They were mere assumptions. The law had declared it so, and so it must be. The good minister had been greatly shocked not a quarter of an hour before at his parting with Grip. For one in his condition to fondle a bird! The yard filled with people, bluff civic functionaries, officers of justice, soldiers, the curious in such matters, and guests who had been bidden as to a wedding. Hugh looked about him, nodded gloomily to some person in authority, who indicated with his hand in what direction he was to proceed, and clapping Barnaby on the shoulder, passed out with the gait of a lion. They entered a large room, so near to the scaffold that the voices of those who stood about it could be plainly heard, some beseeching the javelin men to take them out of the crowd, others crying to those behind to stand back, for they were pressed to death and suffocating for want of air. In the middle of this chamber two smiths with hammers stood beside an anvil. Hugh walked straight up to them, and set his foot upon it with a sound as though it had been struck by a heavy weapon. Then with folded arms he stood to have his irons knocked off, scowling haughtily round, as those who were present eyed him narrowly, and whispered to each other. It took so much time to drag Dennis in, that this ceremony was over with Hugh, and nearly over with Barnaby, before he appeared. He no sooner came into the place he knew so well, however, and among faces with which he was so familiar, that he recovered strength and sense enough to clasp his hands and make a last appeal. "Gentlemen, good gentlemen," cried the abject creature, grovelling down upon his knees and actually prostrating himself upon the stone floor. "Governor, dear governor, honourable sheriffs, worthy gentlemen, have mercy upon a wretched man that has served his majesty and the law and parliament for so many years, and don't let me die because of a mistake." "Dennis," said the governor of the jail, "you know what the course is, and that the order came with the rest. You know that we could do nothing even if we would." "All I ask, sir, all I want and beg, is time to make it sure," cried the trembling wretch, looking wildly round for sympathy. "The king and government can't know it's me. I'm sure they can't know it's me, or they never would bring me to this dreadful slaughter-house. They know my name, but they don't know it's the same man. Stop my execution, for charity's sake, stop my execution, gentlemen, till they can be told that I've been hangman here nigh 30 year. Will no one go and tell them?" he implored, clenching his hands and glaring round and round and round again. "Will no charitable person go and tell them?" "Mr. Akerman," said a gentleman who stood by after a moment's pause, "since it may possibly produce in this unhappy man a better frame of mind, even at this last minute, let me assure him that he was well known to have been the hangman when his sentence was considered." "But perhaps they think on that account that the punishment's not so great," cried the criminal, shuffling towards this speaker on his knees, and holding up his folded hands. "Whereas it's worse 100 times to me than any man. Let them know that, sir, let them know that. They've made it worse to me by giving me so much to do. Stop my execution till they know that." The governor beckoned with his hand, and the two men who had supported him before, approached. He uttered a piercing cry. "Wait, wait, only a moment, only one moment more. Give me a last chance of reprieve. One of us three is to go to Bloomsbury Square. Let me be the one. It may come in that time. It's sure to come. In the Lord's name, let me be sent to Bloomsbury Square. Don't hang me here. It's murder." They took him to the anvil, but even then he could be heard above the clinking of the smiths' hammers, and the hoarse raging of the crowd, crying that he knew of Hugh's birth, that his father was living, and was a gentleman of influence and rank, that he had family secrets in his possession, that he could tell nothing unless they gave him time, but must die with them on his mind; and he continued to rave in this sort until his voice failed him, and he sank down a mere heap of clothes between the two attendants. It was at this moment that the clock struck the first stroke of 12, and the bell began to toll. The various officers, with the two sheriffs at their head, moved towards the door. All was ready when the last chime came upon the ear. They told Hugh this, and asked if he had anything to say. "To say?" he cried. "Not I. I'm ready. Yes," he added, as his eye fell upon Barnaby,
I have a word to say too. Come hither, lad.' There was, for the moment, something kind and even tender struggling in his fierce aspect as he wrung his poor companion by the hand. 'I'll say this,' he cried, looking firmly round, 'that if I had 10 lives to lose, and the loss of each would give me 10 times the agony of the hardest death, I'd lay them all down. Aye, I would, though you gentlemen may not believe it, to save this one,' he added, wringing his hand again, 'that will be lost through me.'
'Not through you,' said the idiot mildly. 'Don't say that. You were not to blame. You have always been very good to me. Hugh, we shall know what makes the stars shine. Now.'
'I took him from her in a reckless mood, and didn't think what harm would come of it,' said Hugh, laying his hand upon his head, and speaking in a lower voice. 'I ask her pardon, and his. Look here,' he added roughly in his former tone. 'You see this lad?'
They murmured 'Yes,' and seemed to wonder why he asked.
'That gentleman yonder,' pointing to the clergyman, 'has often in the last few days spoken to me of faith and strong belief. You see what I am, more brute than man, as I have been often told. But I had faith enough to believe, and did believe as strongly as any of you gentlemen can believe anything, that this one life would be spared. See what he is. Look at him.'
Barnaby had moved towards the door, and stood beckoning him to follow.
'If this was not faith and strong belief,'
cried Hugh, raising his right arm aloft, and looking upward like a savage prophet whom the near approach of death had filled with inspiration,
'where are they? What else should teach me, born as I was born, and reared as I have been reared, to hope for any mercy in this hardened, cruel, unrelenting place? Upon these human shambles, I, who never raised this hand in prayer till now, call down the wrath of God. On that black tree of which I am the ripened fruit, I do invoke the curse of all its victims, past and present and to come. On the head of that man, who in his conscience owes me for his son, I leave the wish that he may never sicken on his bed of down, but die a violent death as I do now, and have the night wind for his only mourner. To this I say, Amen, Amen.'
His arm fell downward by his side. He turned and moved towards them with a steady step, the man he had been before. 'There is nothing more?' said the governor. Hugh motioned Barnaby not to come near him, though without looking in the direction where he stood, and answered,
'There is nothing more.'
'Move forward.'
'Unless,' said Hugh, glancing hurriedly back, 'unless any person here has fancy for a dog, and not then, unless he means to use him well. There's one belongs to me at the house I came from, and it wouldn't be easy to find a better. He'll whine at first, but he'll soon get over that. You wonder that I think about a dog just now,' he added with a kind of laugh. 'If any man deserved it of me half as well, I'd think of him.'
He spoke no more, but moved onward in his place with a careless air, though listening at the same time to the service for the dead, and something between sullen attention and quickened curiosity. As soon as he had passed the door, his miserable associate was carried out, and the crowd beheld the rest. Barnaby would have mounted the steps at the same time. Indeed, he would have gone before them, but in both attempts he was restrained, as he was to undergo the sentence elsewhere. In a few minutes the sheriffs reappeared. The same procession was again formed, and they passed through various rooms and passages to another door, that at which the cart was waiting. He held down his head to avoid seeing what he knew his eyes must otherwise encounter, and took his seat sorrowfully, and yet with something of a childish pride and pleasure, in the vehicle. The officers fell into their places at the sides, in front and in the rear. The sheriff's carriages rolled on. A guard of soldiers surrounded the whole, and they moved slowly forward through the throng and pressure toward Lord Mansfield's ruined house. It was a sad sight, all the show and strength and glitter assembled round one helpless creature, and sadder yet to note, as he rode along, how his wandering thoughts found strange encouragement in the crowded windows and the concourse in the streets, and how even then he felt the influence of the bright sky, and looked up, smiling, into its deep unfathomable blue. But there had been many such sights since the riots were over, some so moving in their nature, and so repulsive too, that they were far more calculated to awaken pity for the sufferers, than respect for that law whose strong arm seemed in more than one case to be as wantonly stretched forth that now all was safe, as it had been basely paralysed in time of danger. Two cripples, both mere boys, one with a leg of wood, one who dragged his twisted limbs along by the help of a crutch, were hanged in the same Bloomsbury Square. As the cart was about to glide from under them, it was observed that they stood with their faces from, not to, the house they had assisted to despoil, and their misery was protracted that this omission might be remedied. Another boy was hanged in Bow Street, other young lads in various quarters of the town. 4 wretched women too were put to death. In a word, those who suffered as rioters were for the most part the weakest, meanest, and most miserable among them. It was a most exquisite satire upon the false religious cry which had led to so much misery, that some of these people owned themselves to be Catholics, and begged to be attended by their own priests. One young man was hanged in Bishopsgate Street, whose aged grey-headed father waited for him at the gallows, kissed him at its foot when he arrived, and sat there on the ground till they took him down. They would have given him the body of his child, but he had no hearse, no coffin, nothing to remove it in, being too poor, and walked meekly away beside the cart that took it back to prison, trying as he went to touch its lifeless hand. But the crowd had forgotten these matters, or cared little about them if they lived in their memory, and while one great multitude fought and hustled to get near the gibbet before Newgate for a parting look, another followed in the train of poor lost Barnaby to swell the throng that waited for him on the spot. End of chapter 77. Barnaby Rudge, chapter 78. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, chapter 78. On this same day, at about this very hour, Mr. Willet the elder sat smoking his pipe in a chamber at the Black Lion. Although it was hot summer weather, Mr. Willet sat close to the fire. He was in a state of profound cogitation with his own thoughts, and it was his custom at such times to stew himself slowly, under the impression that the process of cookery was favourable to the melting out of his ideas, which, when he began to simmer, sometimes oozed forth so copiously as to astonish even himself. Mr. Willet had been several thousand times comforted by his friends and acquaintance with the assurance that for the loss he had sustained and the damage done to the Maypole he could come upon the country. But as this phrase happened to bear an unfortunate resemblance to the popular expression of coming on the parish, it suggested to Mr. Willet's mind no more consolatory visions than pauperism on an extensive scale, and ruin in a capacious aspect. Consequently, he had never failed to receive the intelligent with a rueful shake of the head, or a dreary stare, and had been always observed to appear much more melancholy after a visit of condolence than at any other time in the whole 24 hours. It chanced, however, that sitting over the fire on this particular occasion, perhaps because he was, as it were, done to a turn, perhaps because he was in an unusually bright state of mind, perhaps because he had considered the subject so long, perhaps because of all these favouring circumstances, taken together, it chanced that, sitting over the fire on this particular occasion, Mr. Willet did, afar off, and in the remotest depths of his intellect, perceive a kind of lurking hint, or faint suggestion, that out of the public purse there might issue funds for the restoration of the Maypole to its former high place among the taverns of the earth.
And this dim ray of light did so diffuse itself within him, and did so kindle up and shine, that at last he had it as plainly and visibly before him as the blaze by which he sat, and fully persuaded that he was the first to make the discovery, and that he had started, hunted down, fallen upon, and knocked on the head, a perfectly original idea which had never presented itself to any other man, alive or dead, he laid down his pipe, rubbed his hands, and chuckled audibly. 'Why, father,' cried Joe, entering at the moment, 'you're in spirits to day.' 'It's nothing partickler,' said Mr Willet, chuckling again. 'It's nothing at all partickler, Joseph. Tell me something about the Salwanners.' Having preferred this request, Mr Willet chuckled a third time, and after these unusual demonstrations of levity, he put his pipe in his mouth again. 'What shall I tell you, father?' asked Joe, laying his hand upon his sire's shoulder and looking down into his face. 'That I have come back poorer than a church mouse? You know that. That I have come back maimed and crippled? You know that.' 'It was took off,' muttered Mr Willet, with his eyes upon the fire, 'at the defence of the Salwanners in America, where the war is.' 'Quite right,' returned Joe, smiling and leaning with his remaining elbow on the back of his father's chair. 'The very subject I came to speak to you about. A man with one arm, father, is not of much use in the busy world.' This was one of those vast propositions which Mr Willet had never considered for an instant, and required time to tackle. Wherefore he made no answer. 'At all events,' said Joe, 'he can't pick and choose his means of earning a livelihood as another man may. He can't say, "I will turn my hand to this," or "I won't turn my hand to that," but must take what he can do, and be thankful it's no worse. What do you say?' Mr Willet had been softly repeating to himself in a musing tone the words 'defence of the Salwanners,' but he seemed embarrassed at having been overheard, and answered 'nothing.' 'Now look here, father. Mr Edward has come to England from the West Indies. When he was lost sight of (I ran away on the same day, father), he made a voyage to one of the islands where a school friend of his had settled, and finding him, wasn't too proud to be employed on his estate, and in short, got on well, and is prospering, and has come over here on business of his own, and is going back again speedily. Our returning nearly at the same time, and meeting in the course of the late troubles, has been a good thing every way, for it has not only enabled us to do old friends some service, but has opened a path in life for me which I may tread without being a burden upon you. To be plain, father, he can employ me. I have satisfied myself that I can be of real use to him, and I'm going to carry my one arm away with him, and make the most of it.' In the mind's eye of Mr Willet, the West Indies, and indeed all foreign countries, were inhabited by savage nations, who were perpetually burying pipes of peace, flourishing tomahawks, and puncturing strange patterns in their bodies. He no sooner heard this announcement, therefore, than he leaned back in his chair, took his pipe from his lips, and stared at his son with as much dismay as if he already beheld him tied to a stake and tortured for the entertainment of a lively population. In what form of expression his feelings would have found vent, it is impossible to say, nor is it necessary, for before a syllable occurred to him, Dolly Varden came running into the room in tears, threw herself on Joe's breast without a word of explanation, and clasped her white arms round his neck. 'Dolly!' cried Joe. 'Dolly!' 'Ay, call me that always!' exclaimed the locksmith's little daughter. 'Never speak coldly to me, never be distant, never again reprove me for the follies I have long repented, or I shall die, Joe.' 'I reprove you!' said Joe. 'Yes, for every kind and honest word you uttered, went to my heart. For you, who have borne so much from me, for you, who owe your sufferings and pain to my caprice, for you to be so kind, so noble to me, Joe.' He could say nothing to her, not a syllable. There was an odd sort of eloquence in his one arm which had crept round her waist, but his lips were mute. 'If you had only reminded me by a word, only by one short word,' sobbed Dolly, clinging yet closer to him, 'how little I deserve that you should treat me with so much forbearance! If you had exulted only for one moment in your triumph, I could have borne it better.' 'Triumph!' repeated Joe, with a smile which seemed to say, 'I'm a pretty figure for that.' 'Yes, Triumph!" she cried, with her whole heart and soul in her earnest voice and gushing tears, "for it is won. I am glad to think and know it is. I wouldn't be less humbled, dear. I wouldn't be without the recollection of that last time we spoke together in this place. No, not if I could recall the past and make our parting yesterday." Did ever lover look as Joe looked now? "Dear Joe," said Dolly, "I always loved you. In my own heart I always did, although I was vain and giddy. I hoped you would come back that night. I made quite sure you would. I prayed for it on my knees. Through all these long, long years I had never once forgotten you, or left off hoping that this happy time might come." The eloquence of Joe's arms surpassed the most impassioned language, and so did that of his lips, yet he said nothing either. "And now, at last," cried Dolly, trembling with the fervour of her speech, "if you were sick, and shattered in your every limb, if you were ailing, weak, and sorrowful, if, instead of being what you are, you were in everybody's eyes but mine the wreck and ruin of a man, I would be your wife, dear love, with greater pride and joy than if you were the stateliest lord in England." "What have I done?" cried Joe. "What have I done to meet with this reward?" "You have taught me," said Dolly, raising her pretty face to his, "to know myself and your worth, to be something better than I was, to be more deserving of your true and manly nature. In years to come, dear Joe, you shall find that you have done so, for I will be, not only now, when we are young and full of hope, but when we have grown old and weary, your patient, gentle, never tiring wife. I will never know a wish or care beyond our home and you, and I will always study how to please you with my best affection and my most devoted love. I will, indeed I will." Joe could only repeat his former eloquence, but it was very much to the purpose. "They know of this at home," said Dolly, "for your sake. I would leave even then, but they know it, and are glad of it, and are as proud of you as I am, and as full of gratitude. You'll not come and see me as a poor friend who knew me when I was a girl, will you, dear Joe?" Well, well, it don't matter what Joe said in answer, but he said a great deal, and Dolly said a great deal too, and he folded Dolly in his one arm pretty tight, considering that it was but one, and Dolly made no resistance, and if ever two people were happy in this world, which is not an utterly miserable one, with all its faults, we may with some appearance of certainty conclude that they were. To say that during these proceedings Mr Willet the elder underwent the greatest emotions of astonishment of which our common nature is susceptible, to say that he was in a perfect paralysis of surprise, and that he wandered into the most stupendous and theretofore unattainable heights of complicated amazement, would be to shadow forth his state of mind in the feeblest and lamest terms. If a roc, an eagle, a griffin, a flying elephant, a winged sea horse had suddenly appeared, and taking him on its back, carried him bodily into the heart of the Salwanners, it would have been to him as an everyday occurrence in comparison with what he now beheld. To be sitting quietly by, seeing and hearing these things; to be completely overlooked, unnoticed, and disregarded, while his son and a young lady were talking to each other in the most impassioned manner, kissing each other and making themselves in all respects perfectly at home, was a position so tremendous, so inexplicable, so utterly beyond the widest range of his capacity of comprehension, that he fell into a lethargy of wonder, and could no more rouse himself than an enchanted sleeper in the first year of his fairy lease, a century long. "Father," said Joe, presenting Dolly, "you know who this is?" Mr Willet looked first at her, then at his son, then back again at Dolly, and then made an ineffectual effort to extract a whiff from his pipe, which had gone out long ago. "Say a word, father, if it's only how do you do," urged Joe. "Certainly, Joseph," answered Mr Willet. "Oh yes, why not?" "To be sure," said Joe. "Why not?" "Ah!" replied his father, "why not?" And with this remark, which he uttered in a low voice as though he were discussing some grave question with himself, he used the little finger, if any of his fingers can be said to have come under that denomination, of his right hand as a tobacco stopper, and was silent again.
And so he sat for half an hour at least, although Dolly, in the most endearing of manners, hoped a dozen times that he was not angry with her. So he sat for half an hour quite motionless, and looking all the while like nothing so much as a great Dutch pin or skittle. At the expiration of that period, he suddenly, and without the least notice, burst, to the great consternation of the young people, into a very loud and very short laugh, and repeating, "Certainly, Joseph. Oh yes. Why not?" went out for a walk. End of chapter 78. Barnaby Rudge, chapter 79. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, chapter 79. Old John did not walk near the Golden Key, for between the Golden Key and the Black Lion there lay a wilderness of streets, as everybody knows who is acquainted with the relative bearings of Clerkenwell and Whitechapel, and he was by no means famous for pedestrian exercises. But the Golden Key lies in our way, though it was out of his, so to the Golden Key this chapter goes. The Golden Key itself, fair emblem of the locksmith's trade, had been pulled down by the rioters, and roughly trampled under foot. But now it was hoisted up again in all the glory of a new coat of paint, and showed more bravely even than in days of yore. Indeed, the whole house front was spruce and trim, and so freshened up throughout, that if there yet remained at large any of the rioters who had been concerned in the attack upon it, the sight of the old goodly prosperous dwelling so revived must have been to them as gall and wormwood. The shutters of the shop were closed, however, and the window blinds above were all pulled down, and in place of its usual cheerful appearance, the house had a look of sadness and an air of mourning, which the neighbours, who in old days had often seen poor Barnaby go in and out, were at no loss to understand. The door stood partly open, but the locksmith's hammer was unheard. The cat sat moping on the ashy forge. All was deserted, dark, and silent. On the threshold of this door, Mr Haredale and Edward Chester met. The younger man gave place, and both passing in with a familiar air, which seemed to denote that they were tarrying there, or were well accustomed to go to and fro unquestioned, shut it behind them. Entering the old black parlour, and ascending the flight of stairs, abrupt and steep, and quaintly fashioned as of old, they turned into the best room, the pride of Mrs Varden's heart, and erst the scene of Miggs's household labours. "Varden brought the mother here last night, he told me," said Mr Haredale. "She is above stairs now, in the room over here," Edward rejoined. "Her grief, they say, is past all telling. I needn't add, for that you know beforehand, sir, that the care, humanity, and sympathy of these good people have no bounds." "I am sure of that. Heaven repay them for it, and for much more. Varden is out?" "He returned with your messenger, who arrived almost at the moment of his coming home himself. He was out the whole night, but that of course you know. He was with you the greater part of it." "He was. Without him I should have lacked my right hand. He is an older man than I, but nothing can conquer him." "The cheeriest, stoutest hearted fellow in the world." "He has a right to be, he has a right to be. A better creature never lived. He reaps what he has sown, no more." "It is not all men," said Edward, after a moment's hesitation, "who have the happiness to do that." "More than you imagine," returned Mr Haredale. "We note the harvest more than the seed time. You do so in me." In truth, his pale and haggard face, and gloomy bearing, had so far influenced the remark that Edward was, for the moment, at a loss to answer him. "Tut, tut," said Mr Haredale. "'Twas not very difficult to read a thought so natural, but you are mistaken nevertheless. I have had my share of sorrows, more than the common lot perhaps, but I have borne them ill. I have broken where I should have bent, and have mused and brooded when my spirit should have mixed with all God's great creation. The men who learn endurance are they who call the whole world, brother. I have turned from the world, and I pay the penalty." Edward would have interposed, but he went on without giving him time. "It is too late to evade it now.
I sometimes think that if I had to live my life once more, I might amend this fault. Not so much, I discover when I search my mind, for the love of what is right as for my own sake. But even when I make these bitter resolutions, I instinctively recoil from the idea of suffering again what I have undergone, and in this circumstance I find the unwelcome assurance that I should still be the same man, though I could cancel the past, and begin anew, with its experience to guide me.' 'Nay, you make too sure of that,' said Edward. 'You think so,' Mr Haredale answered, 'and I am glad you do. I know myself better, and therefore distrust myself more. Let us leave this subject for another, not so far removed from it as it might, at first, seem to be. Sir, you still love my niece, and she is still attached to you.' 'I have that assurance from her own lips,' said Edward, 'and you know, I am sure you know, that I would not exchange it for any blessing life could yield me.' 'You are frank, honourable, and disinterested,' said Mr Haredale. 'You have forced the conviction that you are so, even on my once jaundiced mind, and I believe you. Wait here till I come back.' He left the room as he spoke, but soon returned with his niece. 'On that first and only time,' he said, looking from one to the other, 'when we three stood together, under her father's roof, I told you to quit it, and charged you never to return.' 'It is the only circumstance arising out of our love,' observed Edward, 'that I have forgotten.' 'You own a name,' said Mr Haredale, 'I had deep reason to remember. I was moved and goaded by recollections of personal wrong and injury, I know, but even now I cannot charge myself with having, then or ever, lost sight of a heartfelt desire for her true happiness, or with having acted, however much I was mistaken, with any other impulse than the one pure, single, earnest wish to be to her, as far as in my inferior nature lay, the father she had lost.' 'Dear uncle,' cried Emma, 'I have known no parent but you. I have loved the memory of others, but I have loved you all my life. Never was father kinder to his child than you have been to me, without the interval of one harsh hour, since I can first remember.' 'You speak too fondly,' he answered, 'and yet I cannot wish you were less partial, for I have a pleasure in hearing those words, and shall have in calling them to mind when we are far asunder, which nothing else could give me. Bear with me for a moment longer, Edward, for she and I have been together many years, and although I believe that in resigning her to you I put the seal upon her future happiness, I find it needs an effort.' He pressed her tenderly to his bosom, and after a minute's pause, resumed. 'I have done you wrong, sir, and I ask your forgiveness, in no common phrase or show of sorrow, but with earnestness and sincerity. In the same spirit I acknowledge to you both that the time has been when I connived at treachery and falsehood, which if I did not perpetuate myself I still permitted, to rend you two asunder.' 'You judge yourself too harshly,' said Edward. 'Let these things rest.' 'They rise in judgment against me when I look back, and not now for the first time,' he answered. 'I cannot part from you without your full forgiveness, for busy life and I have little left in common now, and I have regrets enough to carry into solitude without addition to the stock.' 'You bear a blessing from us both,' said Emma. 'Never mingle thoughts of me who owe you so much love and duty, with anything but undying affection and gratitude for the past, and bright hopes for the future.' 'The future,' returned her uncle with a melancholy smile, 'is a bright word for you, and its image should be wreathed with cheerful hopes. Mine is of another kind, but it will be one of peace, and free, I trust, from care or passion. When you quit England, I shall leave it too. There are cloisters abroad, and now that the two great objects of my life are set at rest, I know no better home. You droop at that, forgetting that I am growing old, and that my course is nearly run. Well, we will speak of it again, not once or twice, but many times, and you shall give me cheerful counsel, Emma.' 'And you will take it?' asked his niece. 'I'll listen to it,' he answered, with a kiss, 'and it will have its weight, be certain. What have I left to say? You have of late been much together. It is better and more fitting that the circumstances attendant on the past, which wrought your separation, and sowed between you suspicion and distrust, should not be entered on by me.' 'Much, much better,' whispered Emma. 'I avow my share in them,' said Mr Haredale, 'though I held it at the time in detestation. Let no man turn aside, ever so slightly, from the broad path of honour, on the plausible pretence that he is justified by the goodness of his end. All good ends can be worked out by good means. Those that cannot are bad, and may be counted so at once, and left alone.' He looked from her to Edward, and said in a gentler tone, 'In goods and fortune you are now nearly equal. I have been her faithful steward, and to that remnant of a richer property which my brother left her, I desire to add, in token of my love, a poor pittance, scarcely worth the mention, for which I have no longer any need. I am glad you go abroad. Let our ill-fated house remain the ruin it is. When you return, after a few thriving years, you will commend a better and more fortunate one. We are friends?' Edward took his extended hand, and grasped it heartily. 'You are neither slow nor cold in your response,' said Mr Haredale, doing the like by him, 'and when I look upon you now, and know you, I feel that I would choose you for her husband. Her father had a generous nature, and you would have pleased him well. I give her to you in his name, and with his blessing. If the world and I part in this act, we part on happier terms than we have lived for many a day.' He placed her in his arms, and would have left the room, but that he was stopped in his passage to the door by a great noise at a distance, which made them start and pause. It was a loud shouting, mingled with boisterous acclamations, that rent the very air. It drew nearer and nearer every moment, and approached so rapidly that even while they listened it burst into a deafening confusion of sounds at the street corner. 'This must be stopped, quieted,' said Mr Haredale hastily. 'We should have foreseen this and provided against it. I will go out to them at once.' But before he could reach the door, and before Edward could catch up his hat and follow him, they were again arrested by a loud shriek from above stairs, and the locksmith's wife, bursting in, and fairly running into Mr Haredale's arms, cried out, 'She knows it all, dear sir, she knows it all. We broke it out to her by degrees, and she is quite prepared.' Having made this communication, and furthermore thanked Heaven with great fervour and heartiness, the good lady, according to the custom of matrons on all occasions of excitement, fainted away directly. They ran to the window, drew up the sash, and looked into the crowded street. Among a dense mob of persons, of whom not one was for an instant still, the locksmith's ruddy face and burly form could be descried, beating about as though he was struggling with a rough sea. Now he was carried back a score of yards, now onward nearly to the door, now back again, now forced against the opposite houses, now against those adjoining his own, now carried up a flight of steps, and greeted by the outstretched hands of half a hundred men, while the whole tumultuous concourse stretched their throats, and cheered with all their might. Though he was ready and a fair way to be torn to pieces in the general enthusiasm, the locksmith, nothing discomposed, echoed their shouts till he was as hoarse as they, and in a glow of joy and right good humour waved his hat until the daylight shone between its brim and crown. But in all the bandyings from hand to hand, and strivings to and fro, and sweepings here and there, which, saving that he looked more jolly and more radiant after every struggle, troubled his peace of mind no more than if he had been a straw upon the water's surface, he never once released his firm grasp of an arm drawn tight through his. He sometimes turned to clap this friend upon the back, or whisper in his ear a word of staunch encouragement, or cheer him with a smile. But his great care was to shield him from the pressure, and force a passage for him to the golden key. Passive and timid, scared, pale and wondering, and gazing at the throng as if he were newly risen from the dead, and felt himself a ghost among the living, Barnaby. Not Barnaby in the spirit, but in flesh and blood, with pulses, sinews, nerves, and beating heart, and strong affections, clung to his stout old friend, and followed where he led. And thus in course of time they reached the door, held ready for their entrance by no unwilling hands.
Then, slipping in and shutting out the crowd by main force, Gabriel stood between Mr Haredale and Edward Chester, and Barnaby, rushing up the stairs, fell upon his knees beside his mother's bed. 'Such is the blessed end, sir,' cried the panting locksmith to Mr Haredale, 'of the best day's work we ever did. The rogues! It's been hard fighting to get away from 'em. I almost thought once or twice they'd have been too much for us with their kindness.' They had striven all the previous day to rescue Barnaby from his impending fate. Failing in their attempts in the first quarter to which they addressed themselves, they renewed them in another. Failing there, likewise, they began afresh at midnight, and made their way not only to the judge and jury who had tried him, but to men of influence at court, to the young Prince of Wales, and even to the antechamber of the king himself. Successful at last in awakening an interest in his favour, and an inclination to inquire more dispassionately into his case, they had had an interview with the minister in his bed so late as 8 o'clock that morning. The result of a searching inquiry, in which they who had known the poor fellow from his childhood did other good service besides bringing it about, was, that between 11 and 12 o'clock a free pardon to Barnaby Rudge was made out and signed, and entrusted to a horse soldier for instant conveyance to the place of execution. This courier reached the spot just as the cart appeared in sight, and Barnaby being carried back to jail, Mr Haredale, assured that all was safe, had gone straight from Bloomsbury Square to the Golden Key, leaving to Gabriel the grateful task of bringing him home in triumph. 'I needn't say,' observed the locksmith, when he had shaken hands with all the males in the house, and hugged all the females, 45 times at least, 'that except among ourselves I didn't want to make a triumph of it. But directly we got into the street we were known, and this hubbub began. Of the two,' he added, as he wiped his crimson face, 'and after experience of both, I think I'd rather be taken out of my house by a crowd of enemies, than escorted home by a mob of friends.' It was plain enough, however, that this was mere talk on Gabriel's part, and that the whole proceeding afforded him the keenest delight; for the people continuing to make a great noise without, and to cheer as if their voices were in the freshest order, and good for a fortnight, he sent upstairs for Grip, who had come home at his master's back, and had acknowledged the favours of the multitude by drawing blood from every finger that came within his reach, and with the bird upon his arm, presented himself at the first floor window, and waved his hat again until it dangled by a shred between his finger and thumb. This demonstration having been received with appropriate shouts, and silence being in some degree restored, he thanked them for their sympathy, and taking the liberty to inform them that there was a sick person in the house, proposed that they should give 3 cheers for King George, 3 more for Old England, and 3 more for nothing particular, as a closing ceremony. The crowd assenting, substituted Gabriel Varden for the nothing particular, and giving him 1 over for good measure, dispersed in high good humour. What congratulations were exchanged among the inmates at the Golden Key when they were left alone; what an overflowing of joy and happiness there was among them; how incapable it was of expression in Barnaby's own person; and how he went wildly from one to another until he became so far tranquillized as to stretch himself on the ground beside his mother's couch, and fall into a deep sleep, are matters that need not be told. And it is well they happened to be of this class, for they would be very hard to tell, were their narration ever so indisposable. Before leaving this bright picture, it may be well to glance at a dark and very different one, which was presented to only a few eyes that same night. The scene was a churchyard; the time midnight; the persons, Edward Chester, a clergyman, a grave digger, and 4 bearers of a homely coffin. They stood about a grave which had been newly dug, and one of the bearers held up a dim lantern, the only light there, which shed its feeble ray upon the book of prayer. He placed it for a moment on the coffin, when he and his companions were about to lower it down. There was no inscription on the lid. The mould fell solemnly about the last house of this nameless man, and the rattling dust left a dismal echo even in the accustomed ears of those who had borne it to its resting place. The grave was filled in to the top, and trodden down. They all left the spot together. You never saw him living? Asked the clergyman of Edward. Often, years ago, not knowing him for my brother. Never since? Never. Yesterday he steadily refused to see me. It was urged upon him many times at my desire. Still he refused. That was hardened and unnatural. Do you think so? I infer that you do not? You are right. We hear the world wonder every day at monsters of ingratitude. Did it never occur to you that it often looks for monsters of affection as though they were things of course? They had reached the gate by this time, and bidding each other good night, departed on their separate ways. End of chapter 79. Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 80. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, Chapter 80. That afternoon, when he had slept off his fatigue, had shaved, and washed, and dressed, and freshened himself from top to toe, when he had dined, comforted himself with a pipe, an extra Toby, a nap in the great arm-chair, and a quiet chat with Mrs Varden on everything that had happened, was happening, or about to happen, within the sphere of their domestic concern, the locksmith sat himself down at the tea-table in the little back parlour, the rosiest, cosiest, merriest, heartiest, best contented old buck in Great Britain or out of it. There he sat with his beaming eye on Mrs V., and his shining face suffused with gladness, and his capacious waistcoat smiling in every wrinkle, and his jovial humour peeping from under the table in the very plumpness of his legs, a sight to turn the vinegar of misanthropy into purest milk of human kindness. There he sat, watching his wife as she decorated the room with flowers for the greater honour of Dolly and Joseph Willet, who had gone out walking, and for whom the tea-kettle had been singing gaily on the hob full 20 minutes, chirping as never kettle chirped before, for whom the best service of real undoubted china, patterned with divers round-faced mandarins holding up broad umbrellas, was now displayed in all its glory, to tempt whose appetites a clear transparent juicy ham, garnished with cool green lettuce leaves and fragrant cucumber, reposed upon a shady table, covered with a snow-white cloth, for whose delight preserves and jams, crisp cakes and other pastry short to eat, with cunning twists and cottage loaves, and rolls of bread both white and brown, were all set forth in rich profusion, in whose youth Mrs V. herself had grown quite young, and stood there in a gown of red and white, symmetrical in figure, buxom in bodice, ruddy in cheek and lip, faultless in ankle, laughing in face and mood, in all respects delicious to behold. There sat the locksmith, among all and every these delights, the sun that shone upon them all, the centre of the system, the source of light, heat, life, and frank enjoyment in the bright household world. And when had Dolly ever been the Dolly of that afternoon? To see how she came in, arm in arm with Joe, and how she made an effort not to blush or seem at all confused, and how she made believe she didn't care to sit on his side of the table, and how she coaxed the locksmith in a whisper not to joke, and how her colour came and went in a little restless flutter of happiness, which made her do everything wrong, and yet so charmingly wrong that it was better than right. Why, the locksmith could have looked on at this, as he mentioned to Mrs Varden when they retired for the night, for 24 hours at a stretch, and never wished it done. The recollections, too, with which they made merry over that long protracted tea, the glee with which the locksmith asked Joe if he remembered that stormy night at the Maypole, when he first asked after Dolly, the laugh they all had about that night when she was going out to the party in the sedan chair, the unmerciful manner in which they rallied Mrs Varden about putting those flowers outside that very window, the difficulty Mrs Varden found in joining the laugh against herself at first, and the extraordinary perception she had of the joke when she overcame it. The confidential statements of Joe concerning the precise day and hour when he was first conscious of being fond of Dolly, and Dolly's blushing admissions, half volunteered and half extorted, as to the time from which she dated the discovery that she didn't mind Joe. Here was an exhaustless fund of mirth and conversation. Then there was a great deal to be said regarding Mrs Varden's doubts, and motherly alarms, and shrewd suspicions, and it appeared that from Mrs Varden's penetration and extreme sagacity nothing had ever been hidden. She had known it all along, she had seen it from the first, she had always predicted it. She had been aware of it before the principals. She had said within herself, for she remembered the exact words, "That young Willet is certainly looking after our Dolly, and I must look after him." Accordingly she had looked after him, and had observed many little circumstances, all of which she named, so exceedingly minute that nobody else could make anything out of them even now, and had, it seemed, from first to last displayed the most unbounded tact and most consummate generalship. Of course, the night when Joe would ride homeward by the side of the chaise, and when Mrs Varden would insist upon his going back again, was not forgotten; nor the night when Dolly fainted on his name being mentioned; nor the times upon times when Mrs Varden, ever watchful and prudent, had found her pining in her own chamber. In short, nothing was forgotten, and everything by some means or other brought them back to the conclusion that that was the happiest hour in all their lives, consequently that everything must have occurred for the best, and nothing could be suggested which would have made it better. While they were in the full glow of such discourse as this, there came a startling knock at the door, opening from the street into the workshop, which had been kept closed all day, that the house might be more quiet. Joe, as in duty bound, would hear of nothing but himself going to open it, and accordingly left the room for the purpose. It would have been odd enough, certainly, if Joe had forgotten the way to the door, and even if he had, as it was a pretty large one and stood straight before him, he could not easily have missed it. But Dolly, perhaps because she was in the flutter of spirits before mentioned, or perhaps because she thought he would not be able to open it with his one arm (she could have had no other reason), hurried out after him, and they stopped so long in the passage, no doubt owing to Joe's entreaties that she would not expose herself to the draught of July air which must infallibly come rushing in on the same door being opened, that the knock was repeated in a yet more startling manner than before. "Is anybody going to open the door?" cried the locksmith, "or shall I come?" Upon that, Dolly went running back into the parlour, all dimples and blushes, and Joe opened it with a mighty noise, and other superfluous demonstrations of being in a violent hurry. "Well," said the locksmith when he reappeared, "who is it, Joe? What are you laughing at?" "Nothing, sir. It's coming in." "Who's coming in? What's coming in?" Mrs Varden, as much at a loss as her husband, could only shake her head in answer to his inquiring look; so the locksmith wheeled his chair round to command a better view of the room door, and stared at it with his eyes wide open, and a mingled expression of curiosity and wonder shining in his jolly face. Instead of some person or persons straightway appearing, divers remarkable sounds were heard, first in the workshop, and afterwards in the little dark passage between it and the parlour, as though some unwieldy chest or heavy piece of furniture were being brought in, by an amount of human strength inadequate to the task. At length, after much struggling and humping, and bruising of the wall on both sides, the door was forced open as by a battering ram, and the locksmith, steadily regarding what appeared beyond, smote his thigh, elevated his eyebrows, opened his mouth, and cried in a loud voice expressive of the utmost consternation, "Damme, if it ain't Miggs come back!" The young damsel whom he named no sooner heard these words, than deserting a small boy and a very large box by which she was accompanied, and advancing with such precipitation that her bonnet flew off her head, burst into the room, clasped her hands, in which she held a pair of pattens, one in each, raised her eyes devotedly to the ceiling, and shed a flood of tears. "The old story!" cried the locksmith, looking at her in inexpressible desperation. "She was born to be a damper, that young woman; nothing can prevent it." "Ho, master! Ho, Mim!" cried Miggs. "Can I constrain my feelings in these here once again united moments? Oh, Mr Warsen, here's a blessedness among relations, sir; here's forgiveness of injuries; here's amicablenesses." The locksmith
looked from his wife to Dolly, and from Dolly to Joe, and from Joe to Miggs, with his eyebrows still elevated and his mouth still open. When his eyes got back to Miggs, they rested on her, fascinated. "To think," cried Miggs, with hysterical joy, "that Mr. Joe and dear Miss Dolly has rally come together after all as has been said and done contrary. To see them two a settin' along with him and her, so pleasant in all respects, so affable and mild, and me not knowing of it, and not being in the ways to make no preparations for their teas. Oh, what a cutting thing it is, and yet what sweet sensations is awoke within me!" Either in clasping her hands again, or in an ecstasy of pious joy, Miss Miggs clinked her pattens after the manner of a pair of cymbals, at this juncture, and then resumed in the softest accents. "And did my missus think, oh goodness, did she think, as her own Miggs, which supported her under so many trials, and understood her nature when them as intended well but acted rough went so deep into her feelings, did she think as her own Miggs would ever leave her? Did she think as Miggs, though she was but a servant, and knowed that servitudes was no inheritances, would forget that she was the humble instruments as always made it comfortable between them two when they fell out, and always told master of the meekness and forgiveness of her blessed dispositions? Did she think as Miggs had no attachments? Did she think that wages was her only object?" To none of these interrogatories, whereof every one was more pathetically delivered than the last, did Mrs Varden answer one word; but Miggs, not at all abashed by this circumstance, turned to the small boy in attendance, her eldest nephew, son of her own married sister, born in Golden Lion Court, number 27, and bred in the very shadow of the second bell handle on the right hand door post, and with a plentiful use of her pocket handkerchief, addressed herself to him, requesting that on his return home he would console his parents for the loss of her, his aunt, by delivering to them a faithful statement of his having left her in the bosom of that family, with which, as his aforesaid parents well knew, her best affections were incorporated; that he would remind them that nothing less than her imperious sense of duty, and devoted attachment to her old master and missus, likewise Miss Dolly and young Mr. Joe, should ever have induced her to decline that pressing invitation which they, his parents, had, as he could testify, given her, to lodge and board with them, free of all cost and charge, for evermore. Lastly, that he would help her, with her box, upstairs, and then repair straight home, bearing her blessing and her strong injunctions to mingle in his prayers a supplication that he might, in course of time, grow up a locksmith, or a Mr. Joe, and have Mrs Vardens and Miss Dollys for his relations and friends. Having brought this admonition to an end, upon which, to say the truth, the young gentleman for whose benefit it was designed, bestowed little or no heed, having to all appearance his faculties absorbed in the contemplation of the sweetmeats, Miss Miggs signified to the company in general that they were not to be uneasy, for she would soon return, and with her nephew's aid, prepare to bear her wardrobe up the staircase. "My dear," said the locksmith to his wife, "do you desire this?" "I desire it," she answered. "I am astonished, I am amazed, at her audacity. Let her leave the house this moment." Miggs, hearing this, let her into the box fall heavily to the floor, gave a very loud sniff, crossed her arms, screwed down the corners of her mouth, and cried in an ascending scale, "Oh, good gracious!" 3 distinct times. "You hear what your mistress says, my love," remarked the locksmith. "You had better go, I think. Stay. Take this with you, for the sake of old service." Miss Miggs clutched the bank note he took from his pocket book, and held out to her, deposited it in a small red leather purse, put the purse in her pocket, displaying as she did so a considerable portion of some undergarment made of flannel and more black cotton stocking than is commonly seen in public, and tossing her head as she looked at Mrs Varden, repeated, "Oh, good gracious!" "I think you said that once before, my dear," observed the locksmith. "Times is changed this day, mim," cried Miggs, bridling. "You can spare me now, can you? You can keep 'em down without me? You're not in wants of any one to scold or throw the blame upon no longer, ain't you, mim? I'm glad to find you've grown so independent. I wish you joy, I'm sure." With that she dropped a curtsy, and keeping her head erect, her ear towards Mrs Varden, and her eye on the rest of the company as she alluded to them in her remarks, proceeded. I'm quite delighted, I'm sure, to find such independency. Feeling sorry, though, at the same time, mim, that you should have been forced into submissions when you couldn't help yourself. He he he. It must be great vexations, specially considering how ill you always spoke of Mr Joe, to have him for a son-in-law at last, and I wonder Miss Dolly can put up with him either, after being off and on for so many years with a coachmaker. But I have heard say that the coachmaker thought twice about it, he, and that he told a young man as was a friend of his that he hoped he knowed better than to be drawed into that, though she and all the family did pull uncommon strong. Here she paused for a reply, and receiving none, went on as before. I have heard say, mim, that the illnesses of some ladies was all pretensions, and that they could faint away stone dead whenever they had the inclinations to do so. Of course I never see such cases with my own eyes, oh no, he he he, nor master neither, oh no, he he he. I have heard the neighbours make remark as some one as they was acquainted with was a poor good-natured mean-spirited creature as went out fishing for a wife one day and caught a tartar. Of course I never to my knowledge see the poor person himself, nor did you neither, mim, oh no. I wonder who it can be, don't you, mim? No, don't you do, mim? Oh yes, he he he. Again Miggs paused for a reply, and none being offered, was so oppressed with teeming spite and spleen that she seemed like to burst. I'm glad Miss Dolly can laugh, cried Miggs with a feeble titter. I like to see folks a laughing, so do you, mim, don't you? You was always glad to see people in spirits, wasn't you, mim? And you always did your best to keep him cheerful, didn't you, mim? Though there ain't such a great deal to laugh at now, either, is there, mim? It ain't so much of a catch, after looking out so sharp ever since she was a little chit, and costing such a deal in dress and show, to get a poor common soldier with one arm, is it, mim? He he, I wouldn't have a husband with one arm anyways. I would have two arms. I would have two arms if it was me, though instead of hands they'd only got hooks at the end, like our dustman. Miss Miggs was about to add, and had indeed begun to add, that, taking them in the abstract, dustmen were far more eligible matches than soldiers, though to be sure when people were past choosing they must take the best they could get, and think themselves well off too. But her vexation and chagrin being of that internally bitter sort which finds no relief in words, and is aggravated to madness by want of contradictions, she could hold out no longer, and burst into a storm of sobs and tears. In this extremity she fell on the unlucky nephew, tooth and nail, and plucking a handful of hair from his head, demanded to know how long she was to stand there to be insulted, and whether or no he meant to help her carry out the box again, and if he took a pleasure in hearing his family reviled, with other inquiries of that nature, at which disgrace and provocation the small boy, who had been all this time gradually lashed into rebellion by the sight of unattainable pastry, walked off indignant, leaving his aunt and the box to follow at their leisure. Somehow or other, by dint of pushing and pulling, they did attain the street at last, where Miss Miggs, all bloused with the exertion of getting there, and with her sobs and tears, sat down upon her property to rest and grieve, until she could ensnare some other youth to help her home. It is a thing to laugh at, Martha, not to care for, whispered the locksmith, as he followed his wife to the window and good-humouredly dried her eyes. What does it matter? You had seen your fault before. Come. Bring up Toby again, my dear. Dolly shall sing us a song, and we'll be all the merrier for this interruption. End of chapter 80. Barnaby Rudge, chapter 81. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, chapter 81. Another month had passed, and the end of August had nearly come, when Mr Haredale stood alone in the mail coach office at Bristol. Although but a few weeks had intervened since his conversation with Edward Chester and his niece in the locksmith's house, and he had made no change in the meantime in his accustomed style of dress, his appearance was greatly altered. He looked much older and more careworn.
Agitation and anxiety of mind scatter wrinkles and grey hairs with no unsparing hand, but deeper traces follow on the silent uprooting of old habits and severing of dear familiar ties. The affections may not be so easily wounded as the passions, but their hurts are deeper and more lasting. He was now a solitary man, and the heart within him was dreary and lonesome. He was not the less alone for having spent so many years in seclusion and retirement. This was no better preparation than a round of social cheerfulness; perhaps it even increased the keenness of his sensibility. He had been so dependent upon her for companionship and love, she had come to be so much a part and parcel of his existence, they had had so many cares and thoughts in common, which no one else had shared, that losing her was beginning life anew, and being required to summon up the hope and elasticity of youth, amid the doubts, distrust, and weakened energies of age. The effort he had made to part from her with seeming cheerfulness and hope, and they had parted only yesterday, left him more depressed. With these feelings he was about to revisit London for the last time, and look once more upon the walls of their old home, before turning his back upon it for ever. The journey was a very different one in those days from what the present generation find it. But it came to an end, as the longest journey will, and he stood again in the streets of the metropolis. He lay at the inn where the coach stopped, and resolved before he went to bed that he would make his arrival known to no one, would spend but another night in London, and would spare himself the pang of parting, even with the honest locksmith. Such conditions of the mind as that to which he was a prey when he lay down to rest, are favourable to the growth of disordered fancies and uneasy visions. He knew this, even in the horror with which he started from his first sleep, and threw up the window to dispel it by the presence of some object beyond the room which had not been, as it were, the witness of his dream. But it was not a new terror of the night; it had been present to him before, in many shapes. It had haunted him in bygone times, and visited his pillow again and again. If it had been but an ugly object, a childish spectre, haunting his sleep, its return in its old form might have awakened a momentary sensation of fear, which, almost in the act of waking, would have passed away. This disquiet, however, lingered about him, and would yield to nothing. When he closed his eyes again, he felt it hovering near; as he slowly sunk into a slumber, he was conscious of it gathering strength and purpose, and gradually assuming its recent shape. When he sprang up from his bed, the same phantom vanished from his heated brain, and left him filled with a dread against which reason and waking thought were powerless. The sun was up before he could shake it off. He rose late, but not refreshed, and remained within doors all that day. He had a fancy for paying his last visit to the old spot in the evening, for he had been accustomed to walk there at that season, and desired to see it under the aspect that was most familiar to him. At such an hour as would afford him time to reach it a little before sunset, he left the inn and turned into the busy street. He had not gone far, and was thoughtfully making his way among the noisy crowd, when he felt a hand upon his shoulder, and turning, recognized one of the waiters from the inn, who begged his pardon, but he had left his sword behind him. 'Why have you brought it to me?' he asked, stretching out his hand, and yet not taking it from the man, but looking at him in a disturbed and agitated manner. The man was sorry to have disobliged him, and would carry it back again. The gentleman had said that he was going a little way into the country, and that he might not return until late. The roads were not very safe for single travellers after dark, and, since the riots, gentlemen had been more careful than ever not to trust themselves unarmed in lonely places. 'We thought you were a stranger, sir,' he added, 'and that you might believe our roads to be better than they are. But perhaps you know them well, and carry firearms.' He took the sword, and putting it up at his side, thanked the man, and resumed his walk. It was long remembered that he did this in a manner so strange, and with such a trembling hand, that the messenger stood looking after his retreating figure, doubting whether he ought not to follow and watch him. It was long remembered that he had been heard pacing his bedroom in the dead of night, that the attendants had mentioned to each other in the morning how fevered and how pale he looked, and that when this man went back to the inn, he told a fellow servant that what he had observed in this short interview lay very heavy on his mind, and that he feared the gentleman intended to destroy himself, and would never come back alive. With a half consciousness that his manner had attracted the man's attention, remembering the expression of his face when they parted, Mr Haredale quickened his steps, and arriving at a stand of coaches, bargained with the driver of the best to carry him so far on his road as the point where the footway struck across the fields, and to await his return at a house of entertainment which was within a stone's throw of that place. Arriving there in due course, he alighted and pursued his way on foot. He passed so near the Maypole that he could see its smoke rising from among the trees, while a flock of pigeons, some of its old inhabitants doubtless, sailed gaily home to roost between him and the unclouded sky. "The old house will brighten up now," he said, as he looked towards it, "and there will be a merry fireside beneath its ivied roof. It is some comfort to know that everything will not be blighted hereabouts. I shall be glad to have one picture of life and cheerfulness to turn to in my mind." He resumed his walk, and bent his steps towards the Warren. It was a clean, calm, silent evening, with hardly a breath of wind to stir the leaves, or any sound to break the stillness of the time, but drowsy sheep bells tinkling in the distance, and at intervals the far-off lowing of cattle or bark of village dogs. The sky was radiant with the softened glory of sunset, and on the earth and in the air a deep repose prevailed. At such an hour he arrived at the deserted mansion which had been his home so long, and looked for the last time upon its blackened walls. The ashes of the commonest fire are melancholy things, for in them there is an image of death and ruin, of something that has been bright and is but dull, cold, dreary dust, with which our nature forces us to sympathize. How much more sad the crumbled embers of a home, the casting down of that great altar, where the worst among us sometimes perform the worship of the heart, and where the best have offered up such sacrifices, and done such deeds of heroism, as chronicled would put the proudest temples of old time, with all their vaunting annals, to the blush. He roused himself from a long train of meditation, and walked slowly round the house. It was by this time almost dark. He had nearly made the circuit of the building, when he uttered a half suppressed exclamation, started, and stood still. Reclining in an easy attitude with his back against a tree, and contemplating the ruin with an expression of pleasure, a pleasure so keen it overcame his habitual indolence and command of feature, and displayed itself utterly free from all restraint or reserve. Before him, on his own ground, and triumphing then as he had triumphed in every misfortune and disappointment of his life, stood the man whose presence of all mankind in any place, and least of all in that, he could the least endure. Although his blood so rose against this man, and his wrath so stirred within him, that he could have struck him dead, he put such fierce constraint upon himself, that he passed him without a word or look. Yes, and he would have gone on, and not turned, though to resist the devil who poured such hot temptation in his brain required an effort scarcely to be achieved, if this man had not himself summoned him to stop, and that with an assumed compassion in his voice which drove him well nigh mad, and in an instant routed all the self-command it had been anguish, acute, poignant anguish, to sustain. All consideration, reflection, mercy, forbearance, everything by which a goaded man can curb his rage and passion, fled from him as he turned back. And yet he said, slowly and quite calmly, far more calmly than he had ever spoken to him before, "Why have you called to me?" "To remark," said Sir John Chester, with his wonted composure, "what an odd chance it is that we should meet here." "It is a strange chance." "Strange! The most remarkable and singular thing in the world. I never ride in the evening. I have not done so for years. The whim seized me quite unaccountably in the middle of last night. How very picturesque this is!" He pointed, as he spoke, to the dismantled house, and raised his glass to his eye. "You praise your own work very freely." Sir John let fall his glass, inclined his face towards him with an air of the most courteous inquiry, and slightly shook his head as though he were remarking to himself, "I fear this animal is going mad." "I say you praise your own work very freely," repeated Mr Haredale. "Work!" echoed Sir John, looking smilingly round. "Mine! I beg your pardon. I really beg your pardon." "Why, you see," said Mr Haredale, "those walls, you see those tottering gables, you see on every side where fire and smoke have raged, you see the destruction that has been wanting here, do you not?" "My good friend," returned the knight, gently checking his impatience with his hand, "of course I do. I see everything you speak of, when you stand aside and do not interpose yourself between the view and me. I am very sorry for you. If I had not had the pleasure to meet you here, I think I should have written to tell you so, but you don't bear it as well as I had expected. Excuse me. No, you don't indeed." He pulled out his snuff box, and addressing him with the superior air of a man who by reason of his higher nature has a right to read a moral lesson to another, continued, "For you are a philosopher, you know, one of that stern and rigid school who are far above the weaknesses of mankind in general. You are removed a long way from the frailties of the crowd. You contemplate them from a height, and rail at them with a most impressive bitterness. I have heard you." "And shall again," said Mr Haredale. "Thank you," returned the other. "Shall we walk as we talk? The damp falls rather heavily. Well, as you please, but I grieve to say that I can spare you only a very few moments." "I would," said Mr Haredale, "you had spared me none. I would with all my soul you had been in Paradise, if such a monstrous lie could be enacted, rather than here to night." "Nay," returned the other, "really, you do yourself injustice. You are a rough companion, but I would not go so far to avoid you." "Listen to me," said Mr Haredale. "Listen to me." "While you rail?" inquired Sir John. "While I deliver your infamy. You urged and stimulated to do your work a fit agent, but one who in his nature, in the very essence of his being, is a traitor, and would have been false to you, despite the sympathy you two should have together, as he has been to all others, with hints and looks and crafty words, which told again are nothing. You set on Gashford to do this work before us now, with these same hints and looks and crafty words, which told again are nothing. You urged him on to gratify the deadly hate he owes me. I have earned it, I thank Heaven, by the abduction and dishonour of my niece. You did. I see denial in your looks," he cried, abruptly pointing at his face, and stepping back, "and denial is a lie." He had his hand upon his sword, but the knight, with a contemptuous smile, replied to him as coldly as before, "You will take notice, sir, if you can discriminate sufficiently, that I have taken the trouble to deny nothing. Your discernment is hardly fine enough for the perusal of faces, not of a kind as coarse as your speech, nor has it ever been, that I remember, or in one face that I could name, you would have read indifference, not to say disgust, somewhat sooner than you did. I speak of a long time ago, but you understand me. Disguise it as you will, you mean denial. Denial, explicit or reversed, expressed or left to be inferred, is still a lie. You say you don't deny. Do you admit?" "You yourself," returned Sir John, suffering the current of his speech to flow as smoothly as if it had been stemmed by no one word of interruption, "publicly proclaimed the character of the gentleman in question, I think it was in Westminster Hall, in terms which relieve me from the necessity of making any further allusion to him. You may have been warranted, you may not have been, I can't say. Assuming the gentleman to be what you described, and to have made to you, or any other person, any statements that may have happened to suggest themselves to him, for the sake of his own security, or for the sake of money, or for his own amusement, or for any other consideration, I have nothing to say of him, except that his extremely degrading situation appears to me to be shared with his employers. You are so very plain yourself that you will excuse a little freedom in me, I am sure." "Attend to me again, Sir John, but once," cried Mr Haredale. "In your every look, and word, and gesture, you tell me this was not your act."
I tell you that it was, and that you tampered with the man I speak of, and with your wretched son, whom God forgive, to do this deed. You talk of degradation in character. You told me once that you had purchased the absence of the poor idiot and his mother, when, as I have discovered since, and then suspected, you had gone to tempt them and had found them flown. To you I trace the insinuation that I alone reaped any harvest from my brother's death, and all the foul attacks and whispered calumnies that followed in its train. In every action of my life, from that first hope which you converted into grief and desolation, you have stood, like an adverse fate, between me and peace. In all, you have ever been the same cold-blooded, hollow, false, unworthy villain. For the second time, and for the last, I cast these charges in your teeth, and spurn you from me as I would a faithless dog.' With that he raised his arm, and struck him on the breast, so that he staggered. Sir John, the instant he recovered, drew his sword, threw away the scabbard and his hat, and running on his adversary, made a desperate lunge at his heart, which, but that his guard was quick and true, would have stretched him dead upon the grass. In the act of striking him, the torrent of his opponent's rage had reached a stop. He parried his rapid thrusts, without returning them, and called to him with a frantic kind of terror in his face to keep back. 'Not to-night, not to-night!' he cried. 'In God's name, not to-night!' Seeing that he lowered his weapon, and that he would not thrust in turn, Sir John lowered his. 'Not to-night!' his adversary cried. 'Be warned in time!' 'You told me it must have been in a sort of inspiration,' said Sir John, quite deliberately, though now he dropped his mask and showed his hatred in his face, 'that this was the last time. Be assured it is. Do you believe our last meeting was forgotten? Do you believe that your every word and look was not to be accounted for, and was not well remembered? Do you believe that I have waited your time, or you mine? What kind of man is he who entered, with all his sickening cant of honesty and truth, into a bond with me to prevent a marriage he affected to dislike, and when I had redeemed my part to the spirit and the letter, skulked from his, and brought the match about in his own time, to rid himself of a burden he had grown tired of, and cast a spurious lustre on his house? I have acted,' cried Mr Haredale, 'with honour and in good faith. I do so now. Do not force me to renew this duel to-night.' 'You said my wretched son, I think?' said Sir John, with a smile. 'Poor fool! The dupe of such a shallow knave, trapped into marriage by such an uncle and by such a niece. He well deserves your pity. But he is no longer a son of mine. You are welcome to the prize your craft has made, sir.' 'Once more,' cried his opponent, wildly stamping on the ground, 'although you tear me from my better angel, I implore you not to come within the reach of my sword to-night. Oh, why were you here at all? Why have we met? To-morrow would have cast us far apart for ever.' 'That being the case,' returned Sir John, without the least emotion, 'it is very fortunate we have met to-night. Haredale, I have always despised you, as you know, but I have given you credit for a species of brute courage. For the honour of my judgment, which I had thought a good one, I am sorry to find you a coward.' Not another word was spoken on either side. They crossed swords, though it was now quite dusk, and attacked each other fiercely. They were well matched, and each was thoroughly skilled in the management of his weapon. After a few seconds they grew hotter and more furious, and pressing on each other inflicted and received several slight wounds. It was directly after receiving one of these in his arm, that Mr Haredale, making a keener thrust as he felt the warm blood spurting out, plunged his sword through his opponent's body to the hilt. Their eyes met, and were on each other as he drew it out. He put his arm about the dying man, who repulsed him, feebly, and dropped upon the turf. Raising himself upon his hands, he gazed at him for an instant, with scorn and hatred in his looks, but seeming to remember even then that this expression would distort his features after death, he tried to smile, and faintly moving his right hand, as if to hide his bloody linen in his vest, fell back dead, the phantom of last night. End of chapter 81.
Barnaby Rudge, Chapter 82. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Filippone. Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens, Chapter the Last. A parting glance at such of the actors in this little history as it has not in the course of its events dismissed, will bring it to an end. Mr. Haredale fled that night. Before pursuit could be begun, indeed before Sir John was traced or missed, he had left the kingdom, repairing straight to a religious establishment known throughout Europe for the rigour and severity of its discipline, and for the merciless penitence it exacted from those who sought its shelter as a refuge from the world. He took the vows which thenceforth shut him out from nature and his kind, and after a few remorseful years was buried in its gloomy cloisters. 2 days elapsed before the body of Sir John was found. As soon as it was recognized and carried home, the faithful valet, true to his master's creed, eloped with all the cash and movables he could lay his hands on, and started as a finished gentleman upon his own account. In this career he met with great success, and would certainly have married an heiress in the end, but for an unlucky check which led to his premature decease. He sank under a contagious disorder, very prevalent at the time, and vulgarly termed the jail fever. Lord George Gordon, remaining in his prison in the Tower until Monday the 5th of February in the following year, was on that day solemnly tried at Westminster for high treason. Of this crime he was, after a patient investigation, declared not guilty, upon the ground that there was no proof of his having called the multitude together with any traitorous or unlawful intentions. Yet so many people were there, still, to whom those riots taught no lesson of reproof or moderation, that a public subscription was set on foot in Scotland to defray the cost of his defence. For 7 years afterwards he remained, at the strong intercession of his friends, comparatively quiet, saving that he every now and then took occasion to display his zeal for the Protestant faith in some extravagant proceeding which was the delight of its enemies, and saving besides that he was formally excommunicated by the Archbishop of Canterbury for refusing to appear as a witness in the ecclesiastical court when cited for that purpose. In the year 1788 he was stimulated by some new insanity to write and publish an injurious pamphlet reflecting on the Queen of France in very violent terms. Being indicted for the libel, and, after various strange demonstrations in court, found guilty, he fled into Holland in place of appearing to receive sentence, from whence, as the quiet burgomasters of Amsterdam had no relish for his company, he was sent home again with all speed. Arriving in the month of July at Harwich, and going thence to Birmingham, he made in the latter place in August a public profession of the Jewish religion, and figured there as a Jew until he was arrested and brought back to London to receive the sentence he had evaded. By virtue of this sentence he was, in the month of December, cast into Newgate for 5 years and 10 months, and required besides to pay a large fine, and to furnish heavy securities for his future good behaviour. After addressing, in the midsummer of the following year, an appeal to the commiseration of the National Assembly of France, which the English minister refused to sanction, he composed himself to undergo his full term of punishment, and suffering his beard to grow nearly to his waist, and conforming in all respects to the ceremonies of his new religion, he applied himself to the study of history, and occasionally to the art of painting, in which in his younger days he had shown some skill. Deserted by his former friends, and treated in all respects like the worst criminal in the jail, he lingered on, quite cheerful and resigned, until the 1st of November, 1793, when he died in his cell, being then only 43 years of age. Many men with fewer sympathies for the distressed and needy, with less abilities and harder hearts, have made a shining figure and left a brilliant fame. He had his mourners. The prisoners bemoaned his loss, and missed him; for though his means was not large, his charity was great, and in bestowing alms among them he considered the necessities of all alike, and knew no distinction of sect or creed.
There are wise men in the highways of the world who may learn something, even from the poor crazy lord who died in Newgate. To the last he was truly served by bluff John Grueby. John was at his side before he had been 24 hours in the Tower, and never left him until he died. He had one other constant attendant, in the person of a beautiful Jewish girl, who attached herself to him from feelings half religious, half romantic, but whose virtuous and disinterested character appears to have been beyond the censure even of the most censorious. Gashford deserted him, of course. He subsisted for a time upon his traffic in his master's secrets, and, this trade failing when the stock was quite exhausted, procured an appointment in the honourable corps of spies and eavesdroppers employed by the government. As one of these wretched underlings, he did his drudgery, sometimes abroad, sometimes at home, and long endured the various miseries of such a station. 10 or a dozen years ago, not more, a meagre, wan old man, diseased and miserably poor, was found dead in his bed at an obscure inn in the Borough, where he was quite unknown. He had taken poison. There was no clue to his name, but it was discovered from certain entries in a pocket book he carried, that he had been secretary to Lord George Gordon in the time of the famous riots. Many months after the re-establishment of peace and order, and even when it had ceased to be the town talk that every military officer kept at free quarters by the city during the late alarms had cost for his board and lodging £4 4 per day, and every private soldier two and twopenny halfpenny, many months after even this engrossing topic was forgotten, and the United Bulldogs were to a man all killed, imprisoned, or transported. Mr. Simon Tappertit, being removed from a hospital to prison, and thence to his place of trial, was discharged by proclamation on 2 wooden legs. Shorn of his graceful limbs, and brought down from his high estate to circumstance of utter destitution, and the deepest misery, he made shift to stump back to his old master and beg for some relief. By the locksmith's advice and aid, he was established in business as a shoeblack, and opened shop under an archway near the Horse Guards. This being a central quarter, he quickly made a very large connection, and on levee days was sometimes known to have as many as 20 half-pay officers waiting their turn for polishing. Indeed, his trade increased to that extent, that in course of time he entertained no less than 2 apprentices, besides taking for his wife the widow of an eminent bone and rag collector, formerly of Millbank. With this lady, who assisted in the business, he lived in great domestic happiness, only checkered by those little storms which serve to clear the atmosphere of wedlock, and brighten its horizon. In some of these gusts of bad weather, Mr Tappertit would, in the assertion of his prerogative, so far forget himself as to correct his lady with a brush, or boot, or shoe, while she, but only in extreme cases, would retaliate by taking off his legs, and leaving him exposed to the derision of those urchins who delight in mischief. Miss Miggs, baffled in all her schemes matrimonial and otherwise, and cast upon a thankless, undeserving world, turned very sharp and sour, and did at length become so acid, and did so pinch and slap and tweak the hair and noses of the youth of Golden Lion Court, that she was by one consent expelled that sanctuary, and desired to bless some other spot of earth in preference. It chanced at that moment that the justices of the peace for Middlesex proclaimed by public placard that they stood in need of a female turnkey for the county Bridewell, and appointed a day and hour for the inspection of candidates. Miss Miggs, attending at the time appointed, was instantly chosen and selected from 124 competitors, and at once promoted to the office, which she held until her decease more than 30 years afterwards, remaining single all that time. It was observed of this lady, that while she was inflexible and grim to all her female flock, she was particularly so to those who could establish any claim to beauty, and it was often remarked, as a proof of her indomitable virtue and severe chastity, that to such as had been frail she showed no mercy, always falling upon them on the slightest occasion, or on no occasion at all, with the fullest measure of her wrath.
Among other useful inventions which she practised upon this class of offenders and bequeathed to posterity, was the art of inflicting an exquisitely vicious poke or dig with the wards of a key in the small of the back near the spine. She likewise originated a mode of treading by accident in pattens on such as had small feet, also very remarkable for its ingenuity, and previously quite unknown. It was not very long, you may be sure, before Joe Willet and Dolly Varden were made husband and wife, and with a handsome sum in bank, for the locksmith could afford to give his daughter a good dowry, reopened the Maypole. It was not very long, you may be sure, before a red-faced little boy was seen staggering about the Maypole passage, and kicking up his heels on the green before the door. It was not very long, counting by years, before there was a red-faced little girl, another red-faced little boy, and a whole troop of girls and boys, so that, go to Chigwell when you would, there would surely be seen, either in the village street or on the garden, or frolicking in the farmyard, for it was a farm now as well as a tavern, more small Joes and small Dollys than could be easily counted. It was not a very long time before these appearances ensued, but it was a very long time before Joe looked 5 years older, or Dolly either, or the locksmith either, or his wife either, for cheerfulness and content are great beautifiers, and are famous preservers of youthful looks, depend upon it. It was a long time, too, before there was such a country inn as the Maypole in all England. Indeed, it is a great question whether there has ever been such another to this hour, or ever will be. It was a long time, too, for never, as the proverb says, is a long day, before they forgot to have an interest in wounded soldiers at the Maypole, or before Joe omitted to refresh them, for the sake of his old campaign, or before the sergeant left off looking in there now and then, or before they fatigued themselves, or each other, by talking on these occasions of battles and sieges, and hard weather and hard service, and 1,000 things belonging to a soldier's life. As to the great silver snuff-box which the king sent Joe with his own hand, because of his conduct in the riots, what guest ever went to the Maypole without putting finger and thumb into that box, and taking a great pinch, though he had never taken a pinch of snuff before, and almost sneezed himself into convulsions even then? As to the purple-faced vintner, where is the man who lived in those times and never saw him at the Maypole, to all appearances as much at home in the best room as if he lived there? And as to the feastings and christenings and revellings at Christmas, and celebrations of birthdays, wedding days, and all manner of days, both at the Maypole and the Golden Key, if they are not notorious, what facts are? Mr Willet the elder, having been by some extraordinary means possessed with the idea that Joe wanted to be married, and that it would be well for him his father to retire into private life, and enable him to live in comfort, took up his abode in a small cottage at Chigwell, where they widened and enlarged the fireplace for him, hung up the boiler, and furthermore planted in the little garden outside the front door a fictitious Maypole, so that he was at home directly. To this his new habitation, Tom Cobb, Phil Parkes, and Solomon Daisy went regularly every night, and in the chimney corner they all four quaffed and smoked, and prosed and dozed, as they had done of old. It being accidentally discovered after a short time that Mr Willet still appeared to consider himself a landlord by profession, Joe provided him with a slate, upon which the old man regularly scored up vast accounts for meat, drink, and tobacco. As he grew older, this passion increased upon him, and it became his delight to chalk against the name of each of his cronies a sum of enormous magnitude, and impossible to be paid; and such was his secret joy in these entries, that he would be perpetually seen going behind the door to look at them, and coming forth again, suffused with the liveliest satisfaction. He never recovered the surprise the rioters had given him, and remained in the same mental condition down to the last moment of his life. It was like to have been brought to a speedy termination by the first sight of his first grandchild, which appeared to fill him with the belief that some alarming miracle had happened to Joe. Being promptly bloodied, however, by a skilful surgeon, he rallied, and although the doctors all agreed on his being attacked with symptoms of apoplexy 6 months afterwards that he ought to die, and took it very ill that he did not, he remained alive, possibly on account of his constitutional slowness, for nearly 7 years more, when he was one morning found speechless in his bed. He lay in this state, free from all tokens of uneasiness, for a whole week, when he was suddenly restored to consciousness by hearing the nurse whisper in his son's ear that he was going. "I'm a going, Joseph," said Mr Willet, turning round upon the instant, "to the Salwanners," and immediately gave up the ghost. He left a large sum of money behind him, even more than he was supposed to have been worth, although the neighbours, according to the custom of mankind in calculating the wealth that other people ought to have saved, had estimated his property in good round numbers. Joe inherited the whole, and so he became a man of great consequence in those parts, and was perfectly independent. Some time elapsed before Barnaby got the better of the shock he had sustained, or regained his old health and gaiety, but he recovered by degrees, and although he could never separate his condemnation and escape from the idea of a terrific dream, he became, in other respects, more rational. Dating from the time of his recovery, he had a better memory and greater steadiness of purpose, but a dark cloud overhung his whole previous existence and never cleared away. He was not the less happy for this, for his love of freedom and interest in all that moved or grew, or had its being in the elements, remained to him unimpaired. He lived with his mother on the Maypole farm, tending the poultry and the cattle, working in a garden of his own, and helping everywhere. He was known to every bird and beast about the place, and had a name for every one. Never was there a lighter hearted husbandman, a creature more popular with young and old, a blither or more happy soul than Barnaby, and though he was free to ramble where he would, he never quitted her, but was for evermore her stay and comfort. It was remarkable that although he had that dim sense of the past, he sought out Hugh's dog, and took him under his care, and that he never could be tempted into London. When the riots were many years old, and Edward and his wife came back to England with a family almost as numerous as Dolly's, and one day appeared at the Maypole porch, he knew them instantly, and wept and leaped for joy. But neither to visit them, nor on any other pretence, no matter how full of promise and enjoyment, could he be persuaded to set foot in the streets, nor did he ever conquer this repugnance, or look upon the town again. Grip soon recovered his looks, and became as glossy and sleek as ever, but he was profoundly silent. Whether he had forgotten the art of polite conversation in Newgate, or had made a vow in those troubled times to forego for a period the display of his accomplishments, is matter of uncertainty. But certain it is that for a whole year he never indulged in any other sound than a grave decorous croak. At the expiration of that term, the morning being very bright and sunny, he was heard to address himself to the horses in the stable upon the subject of the kettle so often mentioned in these pages, and before the witness who overheard him could run into the house with the intelligence, and add to it upon his solemn affirmation the statement that he had heard him laugh, the bird himself advanced with fantastic steps to the very door of the bar, and there cried, "I'm a devil, I'm a devil, I'm a devil," with extraordinary rapture. From that period, although he was supposed to be much affected by the death of Mr Willet senior, he constantly practised and improved himself in the vulgar tongue, and, as he was a mere infant for a raven when Barnaby was grey, he has very probably gone on talking to the present time. Chapter 82. End of Barnaby Rudge.